The wind howled through Wyoming's Devil's Pass, carrying snow that cut like tiny blades against exposed skin. February 1868, and winter showed no signs of mercy. Mason Reynolds crouched behind a frost-covered boulder, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Blood seeped from a wound in his left shoulder, but he paid it no mind. His eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead. 15 years of hunting had led to this moment. James Rivers, the last of the notorious Rivers gang, was less than 50 yards away, limping through the snow, looking over his shoulder with each labored step. The outlaw had put up a fight worthy of his reputation. Mason's shoulder was evidence of that. But in the end, he was just another man trying to outrun his past. Mason checked his Colt revolver. One bullet left, it would have to be enough. He moved silently from his cover, advancing with the patience of a predator. The wind masked his footsteps as he closed the distance. 30 yards. 20. The outlaw stopped suddenly, seeming to sense the danger. He turned, his hand reaching for his holster. Too late. Mason raised his revolver. "Rivers!" The outlaw's eyes widened in recognition. "The Falcon," he spat, his voice barely audible above the wind. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. "For the 17 souls you sent to early graves." Rivers drew with surprising speed for a wounded man. 2 shots thundered across the pass, echoing off the canyon walls. Mason felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his temple, but his own shot found its mark. Rivers staggered backward, clutching his chest. His heel caught on the edge of the cliff behind him, and for a moment he teetered between life and death. "This ain't it over," Rivers gasped, blood seeping between his fingers. "My blood will see you burn for this." "Your blood should have thought about that before taking innocent lives," Mason replied coldly. Rivers fell backward into the darkness below, his final curse lost to the wind and snow. Mason holstered his weapon and pressed a hand to his bleeding temple. The bounty on James Rivers would be his last. 15 years of hunting men was enough for any soul to bear. He turned to leave but found his legs suddenly weak. The world tilted sideways as he collapsed into the snow, his blood staining the white powder crimson. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a distant lantern bobbing through the blizzard, and a woman's voice calling for help. When Mason awoke 3 days later, he found himself in a small cabin, a young woman with auburn hair tending to his wounds. Her name was Margaret, she told him, daughter of the local blacksmith in Coldwater. She'd been gathering firewood with her father when they heard the gunshots and found Mason bleeding in the snow. "The whole town's talking about you," she said, changing the bandage on his head. "The Falcon, they're calling you, the man who ended the Rivers gang." Mason said nothing, watching her delicate hands work with practiced efficiency. "You can stay until you're healed," she continued. "After that, well, most folks around here would be grateful to have the man who made the trails safe again." He hadn't planned on staying. Bounty hunters didn't put down roots. But something about Margaret's gentle touch and the quiet peace of Coldwater spoke to a part of him long forgotten. Perhaps it was time for the Falcon to rest his wings. 15 years later, Mason Thornwood, the name he'd adopted when he married Margaret, stood at the window of his ranch house, watching snow blanket the Wyoming landscape. He was a different man now, a widower of 3 years, his once dark hair now silver at the temples, his face weathered by sun and sorrow. The man known as the Falcon existed only in whispers and tall tales told in saloons. He rubbed the old scar at his temple absently, a habit formed whenever memories threatened to surface. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 5, jolting him from his reverie. Time to head to the depot. The livestock feed he'd ordered from Cheyenne would be arriving on the morning train. Mason pulled on his heavy coat and gloves, the leather worn from years of ranch work. He cast one final glance at the charred homestead certificate framed above the mantel, the only item Margaret had managed to save from the fire that claimed her life. The edges were blackened, but the names were still legible. Mason and Margaret Thornwood, 160 acres, granted 1868. "I'll be back before noon," he told the empty house, a ritual he'd maintained since her death, as if Margaret might still be listening from somewhere beyond. Outside, the bitter January cold of 1883 greeted him like an old enemy. The Coldwater Depot was quiet at this early hour, save for the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold and the distant whistle of the approaching train. Mason pulled his collar higher against the wind that seemed to find every gap in his clothing. His breath formed thick clouds in the lamplight as he stamped his feet to keep the blood flowing. Powell, the depot manager, nodded as Mason approached. "Mornin', Thornwood. Cold enough to freeze the horns off a bull." "That it is," Mason replied, his words clipped as always. 15 years in Coldwater hadn't softened his tendency toward brevity. The train arrived with a screech of iron wheels against frozen rails, belching steam that rose like ghostly fingers into the dark sky. Mason waited as Powell directed the unloading of his feed sacks, then moved to help. Better to keep moving in this cold. As they worked, a sound caught Mason's attention, faint and easy to miss amid the train's mechanical groans. He paused, head tilted. There it was again, a weak cough coming from one of the freight cars. "You hear that?" he asked Powell. The depot manager shrugged. "Probably just the wind. Plays tricks out here." But Mason was already moving toward the sound, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. The freight car door was iced over, requiring his full strength to slide open. Inside, tucked against a pile of burlap sacks, lay a small figure. A child. A girl no more than 7 years old, her lips tinged blue with cold. Her copper-colored hair was matted, her threadbare coat offering little protection against Wyoming's winter. Pinned to her collar was a scrap of paper, one word scrawled in charcoal: "Unwanted." Mason felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar tightening. He reached out, hesitant, and touched the girl's cheek. Cold. Too cold. "Powell, get over here!" The depot manager peered into the car, his expression changing from curiosity to alarm. "Good Lord, is she—" "Not yet," Mason said, already removing his coat to wrap around the child. "But she will be if we don't get her to Doc Hayes." Powell shook his head. "This ain't your business, Thornwood. County officials should handle it. Orphan's got a process." "She'll be dead before your process starts," Mason cut him off, lifting the girl. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. "My feed can wait." As he carried the child through the town square toward the doctor's house, Mason heard the boarding house porch creak. Victoria Winters stood watching, her arms folded against the cold. "Old fool's playing hero again," she murmured to the merchant beside her, though her tone held more concern than criticism. Mason ignored the comment. The girl's breathing was shallow and wet against his neck, each labored breath a small battle won against the cold. Dr. Elliot Hayes met them at the door in his nightclothes, took one look and said, "Pneumonia, bring her in." Hayes's kitchen smelled of carbolic acid and coffee. Mason laid the child on the table near the stove, and Hayes moved quickly, peeling back her coat, pressing 2 fingers to her throat, counting under his breath. "She's been out there hours," Hayes said, mixing laudanum with honey in a tin cup. "Maybe all night. Temperature's dangerously low." The stove's iron belly ticked as it heated, and Mason heard the girl's breathing, shallow and wet. Hayes managed to get 3 spoonfuls of medicine down her throat before she coughed violently. "She needs laudanum, warm broth, and constant watching," Hayes said. $18 worth of medicine and care. Mason pulled out his wallet, counted the bills and coins. $9.40, all he had until the cattle sale next month. He placed it on the counter. Hayes glanced at the money, then at Mason. "Keep it. You'll need it for your feed." "Can't take charity, Doc." "It ain't charity if I'm deciding." Hayes wrapped the girl in a wool blanket, settled her near the stove. "She'll need watching. Fever's going to spike before it breaks." Mason stood there, hat in his hands, feeling the weight of his 58 years. The girl's face was small, dirt-smudged, her copper-colored hair reminding him of something he couldn't immediately place. Then she hummed, faint, half-conscious, a melody Mason hadn't heard in 3 years. Margaret's lullaby, the one she used to sing while kneading bread or mending clothes by the fire. "Mason," Hayes said quietly, "you hear that?" Mason nodded, didn't trust his voice. Might be coincidence. Might be the laudanum making her delirious. But that melody, Margaret's melody, stirred something long dormant in his chest. By morning, the girl was breathing easier. Hayes had kept her through the night, and Mason had ridden back to his ranch in the dark, 5 miles of frozen road and too many thoughts. When he returned at dawn, Hayes had her sitting up, sipping broth. "She's got a name," Hayes said. "Says it's Sarah." Mason crouched by the chair. "Sarah, I'm Mason. You're safe now." She looked at him with eyes the color of summer sky. Margaret's eyes, he realized with a jolt. "Where's Mama?" The question sat in the room like a stone. Mason didn't have an answer that wouldn't break something inside her. Don't know, child, but you're safe. She nodded, too tired to argue. Her small fingers clutched the blanket tighter, and in that simple gesture, Mason saw a strength that belied her size. What happens to her now? He asked Hayes when Sarah had drifted back to sleep. The doctor's expression was grave. County orphanage in Cheyenne, most likely, unless someone here takes her in. Mason looked at the sleeping child. The melody she'd hummed played in his mind, a ghost of his past life. He should leave her to the county. He was in no position to care for a child. His ranch was a day of quiet chores and solitude, the kind of place where grief lived in the corners. And yet, that melody. I'll take her, he said, surprising himself as much as Hayes, just until she's well enough for the orphanage. Hayes studied him for a long moment. You sure about that, Mason? You've been alone a long while now. I'm sure. Mason wasn't sure at all, but something about leaving Sarah to strangers felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Hayes nodded slowly. I'll bring her by this evening with medicine and instructions. As Mason left the doctor's house, he felt Victoria Winter's eyes on him from the boarding house porch. Her expression was unreadable, but Mason knew what people would say. The reclusive widower taking in a strange child. There would be talk. Let them talk. He'd weathered worse storms than gossip. Mason's ranch sat 5 miles from town, a modest spread nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills. The house was small but sturdy. He'd built it himself when he and Margaret first married. The barn, corral, and chicken coop formed a protective half-circle around the main house, like sentinels standing guard. Since Margaret's death, the place had taken on a neglected air. Not in function, Mason kept the essential work going, but in spirit. The curtains Margaret had sewn remained closed most days. The rocking chair on the porch collected snow rather than the weight of evening conversations. Inside, dust gathered on shelves once adorned with Margaret's small treasures. Only the charred homestead certificate received regular attention, polished weekly as if the act might somehow keep her memory alive. By the time Hayes brought Sarah to the ranch that evening, Mason had cleared out the spare room, aired the musty quilts, and stocked the pantry with what meager supplies he could afford. He'd even found an old rag doll of Margaret's, tucked away in a trunk he rarely opened. Sarah said little as Hayes explained her medication schedule. She clutched a small bundle, her only possessions apparently, and stared wide-eyed at the unfamiliar surroundings. Ranch is quiet, Mason told her when Hayes had gone. Just me and the animals. You'll be safe here. Sarah nodded, her eyes lingering on the certificate above the mantel. That's the homestead paper, Mason explained. Proves this land is ours. Mine, he corrected quickly. It's burned, Sarah observed. There was a fire 3 years back. Is that when your wife died? The question, asked with a child's direct simplicity, caught Mason off guard. Yes, he managed. Her name was Margaret. Sarah moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered yard. My mama's name is Catherine. She's sick. Mason watched her small silhouette against the gathering darkness outside. Is that why you were on the train? Going to find help for her? Sarah shook her head, still looking out the window. Mama said I had to go, said there'd be someone waiting. She turned to look at him. Are you the someone? Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold. I don't know, child, but you're welcome here until we figure things out. That night, Mason settled Sarah in the spare room, awkwardly tucking the quilts around her small frame. Will you tell me a story? She asked as he turned to leave. Mason hesitated in the doorway. Storytelling had been Margaret's domain. Don't know many stories. Then sing a song Mama always sang to me. Mason cleared his throat. I don't sing. Sarah's face fell, but she nodded bravely. That's okay, I can sing to myself. And then, soft and clear in the dim room, she began to hum that melody again. Margaret's lullaby. Mason stood frozen, listening as the familiar notes wrapped around him like a ghost's embrace. The tune was exact, down to the little flourish at the end that Margaret had added herself. Where did you learn that? He asked when she finished. Sarah yawned. Mama taught me. She said her sister made it up. Mason gripped the door frame to steady himself. Her sister? But Sarah was already drifting into sleep, her breathing deep and regular, the laudanum doing its work. Mason retreated to the main room, his mind racing. Margaret had an estranged sister, Catherine. They'd fallen out before Mason met Margaret, some family dispute that Margaret rarely discussed. Could this child be? A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Mason opened the door to find Victoria Winters on his porch, a basket in her arms. "Brought some supplies," she said briskly, pushing past him into the warmth of the house. "Figured you wouldn't have much fit for a child." Victoria was a handsome woman in her early 50s, a widow herself who ran the town's only boarding house with efficiency that bordered on military. Her hair, once as black as a raven's wing, now held strands of silver, but her posture remained ramrod straight. Bread, preserves, a nightgown that should fit her, Victoria listed as she unpacked the basket onto the table, and some of that willow bark tea Hayes swears by for fever. Mason stood awkwardly by the door. "Appreciate it." Victoria surveyed the room critically. "Place could use a woman's touch. When's the last time you aired these curtains?" "Didn't ask you here to critique my housekeeping." Victoria softened slightly. "No, you didn't ask me at all. That's your problem, Mason, never asking for help when you need it." She paused, studying him. "The girl, she's settling in all right." Mason nodded toward the spare room. "Sleeping now. Hayes gave her something for the cough." Victoria moved to the doorway, peering in at the sleeping child. She stood there a long moment, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "She looks like Margaret," she said finally, her voice low. "Something about the eyes." Mason said nothing. He'd noticed it too, but hearing it from Victoria made it more real somehow, more troubling. Victoria turned back to him. "You know about the family continuity review coming in March?" "What?" "Territorial Code Section 412, Victoria said with a bitter edge. "Any homestead without documented family continuity is subject to county assessment." She folded her arms. "Widowers without heirs, spinsters without kin. They got to prove family residency, blood relation, or legal adoption. Otherwise, the land reverts to county control." Mason frowned. "That's a damn fool law." "It's been on the books 2 years. Victoria's mouth tightened. "Lost my husband's claim last year. Same law." "Who's handling these assessments?" "Harrison Reed, new county clerk." Victoria spat the name like it tasted foul. "Every homestead he's reviewed has ended up auctioned to the railroad within a month." Mason felt a coldness settle in his stomach. The ranch was all he had left of his life with Margaret. "You're saying I could lose this place?" "I'm saying you ought to be careful." Victoria glanced toward Sarah's room. Though maybe that child is a blessing in more ways than one. After Victoria left, Mason sat in the darkness, thinking of the law, of the girl, of Margaret's lullaby. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. He thought about Margaret, about the fire 3 years ago, about the fact that he'd been in Cheyenne selling cattle when it happened, 20 miles away while his wife burned. He moved to the spare room doorway, watching Sarah sleep. Her copper hair spread across the pillow, her small face peaceful in the dim light. Was it possible? Could this child be Margaret's niece? Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Where's Mama?" she asked again, her voice small and lost. Mason leaned against the doorframe. "Don't know, child, but I reckon she wanted you safe. That's why you're here." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then closed her eyes again. Mason stood watching her breathe, feeling an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He didn't know who this child was or why she'd been left at the depot, but he knew one thing: he wasn't sending her to the county orphanage. Not after hearing Margaret's lullaby in her voice. February came with a town meeting at the courthouse. Mason didn't want to go, but Victoria insisted. "You need to hear this," she'd said when she rode out to his ranch the day before. "Reed's making an announcement." The courthouse square was packed, 40, maybe 50 people crowding the steps and spilling into the street. The air smelled of wet wool and tobacco smoke. Mason stood near the back, hat pulled low, trying to stay invisible. Sarah remained at the ranch with Hayes, who'd agreed to watch her during the meeting. Harrison Reed climbed the courthouse steps, his boots loud on the wood. He was a lean man, sharp-featured with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Mason felt an immediate dislike for the man. Something about the way he carried himself suggested arrogance born of unearned power. Reed held up a sheaf of papers. Good people of this territory, he began, his voice carrying across the square. I'm here to inform you of a review process. Territorial Code Section 412. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Any homestead without documented family continuity is subject to county assessment. Reed paused, letting the silence build tension. This law has been on the books 2 years, meant to prevent land speculation, keep homesteads in the hands of working families. His smile widened slightly. But it also means widowers without heirs, spinsters without kin. They got to prove family residency, blood relation, or legal adoption. Otherwise, the land reverts to county control. What happens to the land? Someone called from the crowd. Gets resold, fair auction, revenue goes to territorial development. Mason's stomach turned. Fair auction meant Reed's friends, the railroad investors, the men with money. Reed shuffled his papers. Already processed 12 cases last year. Benjamin Hollis lost his claim in June. Samuel Turner, August. He looked directly at Victoria. Thomas Winters, September. Victoria's face went pale. Mason knew Thomas Winters had been her husband, knew he died 2 years back, leaving Victoria with a boarding house and no children. How much notice they get? Another voice called. 60 days, standard procedure. Reed scanned the crowd, his gaze settling on Mason. And I see we've got another case pending. Mason Thornwood, widower, no documented heirs, took in a child recently. His smile turned cold. Charitable, no doubt, but charity ain't family under the law. Every head turned. Mason felt the weight of 50 eyes, heard the whispers starting. He stepped forward. That girl's my kin. Reed's smile widened. Then you'll have no trouble providing documentation. Birth records, marriage certificates, proof of relation. I'll get it. You've got 60 days, Thornwood. Clock starts today. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Mason turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the frozen ground. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder. As the crowd dispersed, Mason felt a hand on his arm. Sheriff Daniel Sullivan, a weathered man in his mid-40s with a silver mustache and eyes that missed nothing. Walk with me, Sullivan said quietly. They moved away from the courthouse towards Sullivan's office, neither speaking until they were inside the small, cluttered space. Reed's got his eye on your place, Sullivan said without preamble. Prime location, water access, timber, railroad would pay top dollar. Mason remained standing, hat in hand. Not selling. Might not have a choice unless you can prove that girl's your blood. Sullivan studied him. Is she? Might be, pues she, Mason said cautiously. My wife had a sister. They weren't close, but... Sullivan nodded slowly. Find the proof. Reed's not a man who takes might be for an answer. Mason turned to leave, but Sullivan's next words stopped him cold. I know who you are, Falcon. Mason's hand froze on the doorknob. He turned slowly. Don't know what you're talking about. Sullivan leaned back in his chair. 15 years is a long time, but not long enough to forget the man who ended the Rivers gang. He gestured to the scar on Mason's temple. That mark's pretty distinctive. Mason's jaw tightened. That life's behind me. Is it? Sullivan opened a desk drawer, pulled out a wanted poster, yellowed with age. The sketch was crude but recognizable. A younger Mason with a Falcon insignia on his gun belt. Because I'm wondering if Reed's interest in your land has nothing to do with the railroad and everything to do with who you used to be. Mason stared at the poster. What are you saying? I'm saying Harrison Reed isn't his real name. And that fire that killed your wife? Sullivan's eyes narrowed. Mighty convenient timing, wouldn't you say? A cold dread settled in Mason's gut. Who is he? Joseph Rivers, youngest brother of James Rivers, the last man the Falcon killed. The room seemed to tilt sideways as Mason absorbed the information. Margaret's face flashed in his mind, her smile as she waved goodbye the morning he left for Cheyenne, not knowing it would be the last time he'd see her alive. He killed her, Mason whispered. Because of me. Sullivan nodded grimly. I believe so. Been watching him since he arrived last year. The land seizures, the railroad deals, it's all a cover. His real target has always been you. Mason's hand moved instinctively to his hip, where his gun would have been in his former life. I'll kill him. And hang for murder. Sullivan shook his head. That's what he wants. You dead or gone. Either way he wins. Then what do you suggest? Play his game, but better. Find proof the girl is your kin. Build your case. Sullivan leaned forward, and when the time is right, we'll expose him for who he really is. Mason stared out the window at the courthouse where Reed Rivers had just stood. The man had killed Margaret, had been plotting revenge for 15 years. And now he was threatening to take the last thing Mason had left, the land he and Margaret had built together. 60 days, Mason said, not much time. Then we better get started, Sullivan replied. Mason returned to the ranch to find Sarah awake and curious about the town meeting. He gave her a simplified version. I'll mayhem. Omitting Reed's threats and the revelation of his true identity. Will I have to go away? She asked, her small face serious in the firelight. No, Mason said firmly. This is your home now, for as long as you want it. The words surprised him as they left his mouth, but he found he meant them. In just a few days, Sarah had brought something back to the ranch that had been missing since Margaret died. Not happiness, exactly, but purpose. The next morning, Mason set Sarah to learning simple chores, gathering eggs from the hen house, feeding the chickens, checking the water trough for ice. She worked without complaint, her hands red from the cold, her breath white in the morning air. You got a trunk in the barn, she said as they mucked out the stalls, with pretty flowers painted on it. Mason paused, pitchfork in hand. How do you know about that? Saw it when I was exploring. Sarah looked up at him. Is it a treasure chest? Mason hadn't opened that trunk in 3 years. It contained Margaret's personal belongings, her clothes, her Bible, her jewelry box with the few simple pieces he'd given her over the years. In a way, he said finally, it belonged to Margaret. Sarah's eyes widened. Can I see inside? Mason's first instinct was to refuse. The trunk was private, sacred in a way, but something in Sarah's expression, a mix of hope and fear of rejection, made him reconsider. After chores, he said, if there's time before dark. They finished the barn work as the winter sun began its early descent. Mason led Sarah to the back corner where the trunk sat covered in a tarp. He pulled the cover away, revealing the cedar chest with painted wildflowers that Margaret had loved so much. Pretty, Sarah whispered, running her small fingers over the faded flowers. Mason knelt before the trunk, hesitating a moment before lifting the lid. The scent of lavender, Margaret's favorite, wafted up, faint but present even after 3 years. Inside lay her folded dresses, her shawl, her Sunday hat with the blue ribbon. Sarah peered inside reverently, not touching anything until Mason nodded permission. She carefully lifted out a leather-bound book. What's this? Mason took it gently. Margaret's diary. He'd never read it, feeling it would be an invasion of her privacy, even after death. Sarah's attention had already moved on to something else, a small cloth doll tucked in the corner of the trunk. She lifted it with a small cry of recognition. My doll! Mama made this for me. She hugged it to her chest, her eyes bright with tears. Mason frowned. That was Margaret's doll. She kept it from childhood. Sarah shook her head vehemently. No, Mama made this. See the red hair? She showed him the yarn strands sewn onto the doll's head. And the blue dress. Mama said it was special, that I should never lose it. Mason looked more closely at the doll. It did look handmade and relatively new, not old enough to have been Margaret's childhood toy. Had Margaret made it? But for whom? He opened the diary, something he'd promised himself he wouldn't do, and began turning pages. Margaret's neat handwriting filled each page, recounting daily life, her hopes, her worries. He skipped ahead to the last year of her life, scanning entries. Then a name caught his eye. Catherine. April 12, 1876. Catherine wrote from Omaha. Her baby girl was born 3 weeks ago. Club foot, poor thing, but the surgery went well. She named her Sarah. I told Mason we should bring them here once Catherine is strong enough. This territory is no place to raise a child alone. Mason's vision blurred. Catherine, Margaret's younger sister. He remembered Margaret mentioning her, though they'd been estranged over some family dispute. Married to a railroad man who died in an accident. He'd sent money once or twice at Margaret's request, but they'd never visited. And then the letters had stopped. Sarah, he said slowly, looking at the child clutching the doll. Your mother's name is Catherine. Catherine Bennett. Sarah nodded. How did you know? And your father's name? William Bennett. He died when I was a baby. Mama said he worked for the railroad. Mason felt something crack open in his chest. Sarah wasn't some random child left at the depot. She was Catherine's daughter, Margaret's niece, his niece. The door banged open and Victoria entered without knocking, stamping snow from her boots. Found something, she announced, then stopped short at the sight of them kneeling by the open trunk. Am I interrupting? Mason stood, the diary still in his hand. What did you find? Victoria pulled a folded paper from her coat. Asked around about Catherine Bennett in Omaha. She died, Mason. Cholera outbreak in 1881. Orphanage took Sarah, but their records burned in a fire last year. Sarah's small face crumpled. Mama's dead? Mason realized with horror that Sarah hadn't known. The child had been holding on to hope that her mother was alive somewhere, waiting for her. Victoria knelt beside Sarah, her usually brusque manner softening. I'm so sorry, child, but I learned something else. Your mother loved you very much. Before she died, she made arrangements for you to come here, to her sister's husband. Sarah looked up at Mason, tears streaming down her face. You're my uncle? Mason nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. Seems that way. He showed Victoria the diary entry. Margaret knew about Sarah, wanted to bring them here. Victoria read the entry, then looked up sharply. Why didn't you know about this? I was gone a lot those last years. Cattle drives, market trips. Mason closed the diary, his hands shaking. Margaret must have mentioned it, but He trailed off, remembering how preoccupied he'd been, how often he'd half listened to Margaret's talk of family matters. This proves she's family, Victoria said, tapping the diary. No, Mason replied grimly. It proves Margaret knew about her, but without Catherine's birth certificate, without marriage records, without legal proof, it's just a diary entry, hearsay. Then what good is it? It's a start, Mason said, but we need more, official documents. Victoria stood, gathering her shawl around her. I'll keep asking. Someone in Omaha must remember Catherine Bennett. After Victoria left, Mason sat with Sarah by the fire, the diary in his lap, the doll in her arms. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Uncle Mason, she asked hesitantly, trying out the title. Did Aunt Margaret talk about me? Mason opened the diary to the last entry, dated 2 days before the fire. I dreamed of Sarah last night. She was standing in a field of lavender, calling for her mother. I woke up crying. Mason says I'm being foolish, that Catherine is fine, but I can't shake the feeling something's wrong. He closed the book without reading it aloud. Yes, he said instead. She talked about you, wanted to meet you. Sarah leaned against him, her small body warm against his side. I'm glad I found you. Mason put his arm around her awkwardly. This child who'd been thrown away and found, who hummed Margaret's lullaby without knowing why, who asked questions that cut straight to the bone. I'm glad too, little one, he said softly. I'm glad too. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Mason stood at the barn door, watching Sarah navigate the icy path to the chicken coop, her small figure bundled against the chill. For a child who'd spent her life in a city, she adapted to ranch life with surprising ease. There was a resilience to her that reminded Mason of Margaret, that quiet determination to face whatever came without complaint. Inside the barn, Mason checked on the pregnant cows. Calving season would start in April, bringing new life and long nights of vigilance. As he worked, he heard Sarah singing to the chickens, her voice carrying through the cold air. Eggs need coaxing, she explained when she returned, basket in hand. Mama said animals know when you're nervous. Your mama was right, Mason replied, taking the basket. 6 eggs, not bad for winter. Sarah wandered deeper into the barn, exploring with the natural curiosity of childhood. Mason kept half an eye on her as he forked fresh hay into the stalls. When she disappeared around a corner, he called out, Stay where I can see you, Sarah. What's this? Her voice echoed from the back storage area. Mason found her examining an old branding iron leaning against the wall, crusted with disuse. He'd forged it himself 20 years back. A simple design, the letters MT inside a 5-pointed star. That's the family brand, he said, taking it from her small hands. Empty star means the cattle belong to us. Sarah ran her fingers over the rust-covered iron. What's it for? Branding. When a calf is born, you heat the iron and press it to the hide. Leaves a mark that don't fade. Does it hurt? Mason considered sugarcoating the truth, then decided against it. Sarah deserved honesty. For a moment, but it heals quick. She set the iron down carefully. Do I get a brand? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? You said it means the cattle belong to you. Her blue eyes, Margaret's eyes, looked up at him earnestly. Do I belong to you? To the family? Mason crouched down, looked her in the eye. Your family, Sarah. Family don't need brands. She considered this, then nodded seriously. Okay. From outside, Mason heard the creak of a saddle, then a voice from Morning, Thornwood? He turned to find Walter Franklin, his nearest neighbor, sitting atop his horse by the barn door. Franklin was in his 40s, weathered and quiet, the kind of man who kept to himself but showed up when work needed doing. Franklin, Mason nodded in greeting. Something I can help you with? Franklin's eyes shifted to Sarah, who had moved to stand slightly behind Mason. Saw the girl learning your trade. That's family work. Mason straightened, suddenly wary. She's learning to pull her weight. Franklin nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. Reed's been asking around, wants to know if you're really keeping her or just playing church. Tell him whatever you want. Franklin touched the brim of his hat. I'll tell him she's working. That's all I saw. He paused, then added in a lower voice. Reed came by my place yesterday. Asked a lot of questions about you. Your past. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. What kind of questions? Where you came from, what you did before ranching. Franklin's eyes narrowed slightly. Said he knew you from somewhere. Never met the man before the town meeting. That's what I told him. Franklin shifted in his saddle. But he seemed mighty interested in that scar of yours. He gestured to Mason's temple. Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the old wound. A lot of men got scars. True enough. Franklin turned his horse to leave, then looked back. My boy Thomas, he's 25 now, ranch hand down in Colorado. The Rivers gang would have killed my entire family if not for you. Mason tensed. Franklin? Don't worry, I've kept your secret all these years. Franklin touched his hat brim. Just wanted you to know, there are more folks around here who remember what the Falcon did for this territory than Reed might think. With that, Franklin rode away, leaving Mason and Sarah standing in the barn doorway. What was he talking about, Uncle Mason? Sarah asked. Who's the Falcon? Mason watched Franklin disappear over the rise. Just an old story, nothing more. He turned back to the barn, hoping Sarah wouldn't notice how his hands had begun to shake. Come on, we've got work to finish. Later, as the winter sun began its early descent, Mason found Sarah in the main house, sitting cross-legged before the hearth, examining the cloth doll from Margaret's trunk. She needs washing, Sarah declared, brushing dust from the doll's dress. And her hair is all tangled. Mason settled into his chair, watching her gentle ministrations. Your mother made that doll? Sarah nodded, not looking up. For my birthday, she said it was special, that I should always keep it with me. She turned the doll over in her hands. I thought I lost it when they took me to the orphanage. How did Aunt Margaret get it? Mason frowned. I don't know. Margaret never mentioned it. Sarah continued grooming the doll, humming Margaret's lullaby softly. The melody filled the small room, wrapping around Mason like a familiar blanket. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow and distant pine. Uncle Mason, Sarah said suddenly, can we fix the branding iron? It's all rusty. Oui, wa. For the new calves in spring, Franklin said it's family work. Mason studied her earnest face illuminated by the firelight. Yes, he said finally. We can fix it. When the weather breaks, we'll take it to Parker's, the blacksmith. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her small face, chasing away the shadow of sorrow that had lingered since Victoria's news about Catherine. And I can help with the calves when they come? Mason hesitated. Calving was hard work, bloody, exhausting, and sometimes heartbreaking when a calf didn't make it. But he'd promised. Yes, you can help. Sarah seemed satisfied with this and returned to her doll. Mason watched her small fingers work, thinking of Margaret, of Catherine, of the strange twists of fate that had brought this child to his door carrying his wife's melody in her voice and her sister's doll in her hands. Joseph Rivers, wanted his land, wanted revenge for his brother's death. But Mason had something worth fighting for now, something more than just acres and memories. A week later, Mason rode into town alone, leaving Sarah with Franklin's wife Rebecca, who had volunteered to teach the girl how to knit. The February cold had deepened, freezing the mud into treacherous ridges that forced Mason's horse to pick its way carefully down Coldwater's main street. The courthouse square was busier than usual. Wagons lined up at the mercantile, horses tied to the rail, people clustered in groups talking low. As Mason dismounted, he noticed their conversations falter, heads turning to watch his approach. Then he saw it, nailed to the courthouse door, a poster the size of a saddle blanket, black ink on white paper, the official county seal at the top, abandonment decree, notice of forfeiture review. Mason pushed through the crowd. His name was at the top of the list. Mason Thornwood, Homestead Parcel 47B. Charges, no documented family continuity per Territorial Code Section 412. 60-day notice expires May 1st, 1883. Failure to provide blood relation or legal adoption papers results in homestead forfeiture and county resale. Below his name were two others, widows he knew from church. It's a disgrace, someone muttered behind him. Man works his land 20 years. Suddenly he's got to prove his own family. Mason turned to find Sheriff Sullivan standing there, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Reed moved faster than I expected," Sullivan said quietly. "Usually he waits a few weeks before posting the notice public." "He's sending a message," Mason replied, his voice low, "making sure everyone knows I'm in his sights." They moved away from the courthouse towards Sullivan's office. Mason felt eyes following him, some sympathetic, others wary, as if his misfortune might be contagious. Inside the sheriff's office, Sullivan closed the door and pulled a bottle from his desk drawer. "Figured you could use a drink." Mason accepted the whiskey, downing it in one swallow. The burn in his throat was welcome, something to focus on besides the cold rage building inside him. "I've been digging," Sullivan said, pouring himself a measure. "Found Reed's private ledger. He keeps it locked in his office safe, but the county clerk has a key." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Legal, is it? Going through another man's private papers?" Sullivan's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "Not strictly, but neither is forging abandonment certificates." "He's forging documents?" "I believe so." Sullivan pulled out a leather-bound book from his desk. "This ledger is filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts. Thomas Winters, Benjamin Hollis, Samuel Turner, all folks who lost their homesteads. Next to each name is a notation. R.C. Railroad Investment Company, 500. Mason leaned forward. "What's R.C. Railroad?" "Railroad Expansion Company. They've been buying up homesteads along the proposed rail corridor from Laramie to Casper." Sullivan closed the ledger. "The county auctions the land for 200. Railroad buys it for 500. Reed pockets the difference." "It's fraud," Mason said, the pieces falling into place. "Clear as day." "Yes, but I need more than this. Need witness testimony. Need proof the signatures are forged. Need a judge's order." Sullivan leaned back in his chair. "But I can build a case." Mason thought of Sarah waiting at Franklin's house, thinking of him as family now. "I can't wait for a case to be built. I need to protect what's mine now." "Then prove the girl's your family. Publicly." Sullivan tapped his desk. "Territorial law says family continuity includes trade participation. If a child works a homestead's primary trade, branding cattle, milling grain, whatever, and it's witnessed by community members, that counts as family labor." "Calving season starts in April," Mason said slowly, understanding dawning. "First calves due when?" "Late April, usually." Sullivan nodded. "Brand it, public ceremony, invite witnesses, have the girl hold the iron." Mason frowned. "She's 7 years old." "I know, but if she can do it, if she can prove she's learning your trade, that's family continuity under the law." Mason considered this. Sarah was small but determined. She'd already shown interest in the branding iron, in being part of the family work. But to put her in such a public position, with all eyes watching, judging, Can you stop the May 1st deadline? He asked. Sullivan shook his head. Not without a judge's order. But if you make it to May 1st and prove family publicly, I can file charges against Reed the same day. You're saying the whole town needs to watch. That's exactly what I'm saying. Sullivan leaned forward intently. Make it so public Reed can't challenge it. Make it so obvious even a territorial judge can't ignore it. Mason stood, hat in hand. I'll think on it. As he turned to leave, Sullivan added, one more thing. Reed knows who you are. He's been asking questions all over town, trying to confirm you're the Falcon. Mason paused at the door. Let him ask. That man died a long time ago. Did he? Sullivan's voice was quiet but penetrating. Because Reed believes the Falcon killed his brother, and he's been planning revenge for 15 years. The land seizure is just part of it. What are you saying? I'm saying watch your back, Mason, and the girls. A man like Joseph Rivers doesn't stop at legal maneuvering when blood vengeance is on the line. Mason left the sheriff's office with a heaviness in his chest. The town seemed different now, every glance potentially hostile, every conversation a possible trap. He made his way to the mercantile, gathering supplies they'd need for the coming weeks. The storekeeper, Hobbs, watched him with undisguised curiosity. Heard about the notice, Hobbs said as he weighed out sugar. Damn shame a man having to prove his own kin. Mason said nothing, counting out coins. The girl settling in all right? Hobbs continued, undeterred by Mason's silence. Mrs. Hobbs noticed she's got your wife's eyes, same color blue. Margaret's sister's child, Mason said quietly. Is that so? Mrs. Hobbs emerged from the back room, her interest piqued. I can see it, the hair too. That copper color runs in families. Mason paid for the supplies, reaching for the flour sack. As he did, the door banged open. Harrison Reed walked in, his boots loud on the wood floor. The store went quiet. Reed smiled, tipped his hat to Mrs. Hobbs. Morning, everyone. His gaze landed on Mason. Thornwood, still wasting money on supplies? Mason picked up the flour sack. Still got a roof to store them under. For now. Reed leaned against the counter, casual in his arrogance. You know, I've been reviewing your case. Checked the county records twice. No adoption papers filed. No birth certificates linking that girl to your wife's family. Nothing. Working on it. Working on what? Making up documents? Reed's voice rose just enough for everyone in the store to hear. First you forged your signature to waive contestation rights. Now you're stalling. Mason's jaw clenched. I never signed that paper. Then prove it. Mrs. Hobbs cleared her throat. Mr. Reed, I've seen Mason's signature. He signs the store ledger every time he buys on credit. That decreased signature don't look the same to me. Reed's smile tightened. You an expert on handwriting. Mrs. Hobbs? No, but I got eyes. Hobbs stepped forward, opening the store ledger, flipping to Mason's account. Here, March 2nd, March 9th, and here's the decree copy Victoria showed me. He set them side by side. Don't match. Reed glanced at the ledger, his expression unchanging. Witnesses won't save you, Thornwood. Only paper does. He turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. The store stayed quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Hobbs said softly, We believe you, Mason. Mason nodded, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. He gathered his supplies and left quickly before anyone could see how much their support had affected him. Outside, Reed stood waiting, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Walk with me, Thornwood. It wasn't a request. Mason set his supplies in his wagon, then followed Reed a short distance down the street. They stopped in the alley beside the telegraph office, away from curious eyes. Enough pretending, Reed said, his voice low and venomous. You and I both know the truth about Devil's Pass. Mason's eyes hardened. Your brother chose his path. And you chose yours when you pulled that trigger. Reed's smile returned, cold and calculating. First your wife, now your land, and finally your life. Your brother was an outlaw with 17 murders to his name. Reed's face registered brief surprise at the admission, then hardened. So it is true. What do you want? Everything you took from me. Reed stepped closer. My brother, my family name, my future. Your brother chose his path, and you chose yours. Now you'll pay for it. Reed's smile returned, cold and calculating. First your wife, now your land, and finally your life. Mason's hand curled into a fist, every instinct screaming to strike this man who'd murdered Margaret. But he held himself in check, aware they were in public view, that violence would only play into Reed's hands. You won't win, Mason said simply. I already have. Reed straightened his jacket. The notice is posted. 60 days, and that ranch becomes railroad property. As for the girl, well, orphans have a way of disappearing in this territory. The threat to Sarah snapped something in Mason. He grabbed Reed by the collar, slamming him against the wall. You go near her and I'll send you to meet your brother. Reed didn't resist, his smile never wavering. There he is, the killer I remember. Mason released him abruptly, stepping back. People were watching from the street now, drawn by the commotion. Violence against a county official, Reed said loudly, straightening his collar. That's jail time, Thornwood. Sheriff Sullivan appeared as if summoned. Problem here, gentlemen? Reed smoothed his jacket. Just a misunderstanding. Mr. Thornwood was explaining his connection to the girl, rather forcefully. Sullivan looked between them, his expression neutral. Mason, your wagon's loaded. Best be getting back before the weather turns. Mason nodded stiffly, turning to leave. 60 days, Reed called after him. Clock's ticking. Mason returned to find Sarah at the kitchen table, flour dusting her nose as Rebecca Franklin showed her how to roll dough. Look, Uncle Mason, she called excitedly. I'm making biscuits like Mama used to. Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron. She's a natural, Mason. Quick learner. Mason nodded his thanks, setting the supplies on the counter. Appreciate you watching her. It was my pleasure. Rebecca's eyes held a question she didn't voice. Instead, she said, Walter told me about the notice. If there's anything we can do. We'll be fine, Mason said more curtly than he intended. Rebecca nodded, gathering her shawl. Sarah, remember what I showed you about the stitching. Practice makes perfect. After she left, Sarah returned to her dough, carefully cutting circles with a tin cup. Mrs. Franklin says I should call her Aunt Rebecca. Is that all right? If you want. Mason hung his coat by the door, his mind still on Reed's threats. She said I'm family now, even if the papers don't say so yet. Sarah placed the biscuits on a baking sheet. Is that true? Mason looked at this child who'd entered his life so suddenly, who'd somehow found a place in his heart despite his best efforts to keep her at a distance. Yes, he said finally, it's true. Sarah nodded, satisfied, and slid the biscuits into the oven. I found something today, while you were gone. What's that? She disappeared into her room, returning with her doll. Watch. She twisted the doll's head, revealing a small cavity in the body. There's a secret place inside. Mason examined the hidden compartment. It was cleverly made, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Your mother put this here? Sarah nodded. She said it was for keeping special things safe, but it's empty now. Mason frowned, turning the doll over in his hands. Did it have something in it before? I don't know. Mama kept it most of the time. Said it wasn't a toy, not really. Sarah took the doll back, closing the compartment. Why would she make a hiding place with nothing to hide? It was a good question. Catherine Bennett had gone to considerable trouble to create a secret compartment in her daughter's doll, then insisted the girl keep it with her when she was sent away. There must have been something inside, something important enough to protect, yet not there when Sarah needed it most. Maybe someone found it, Mason suggested. At the orphanage? Sarah shook her head. I didn't have it there. Mama gave it to a lady the day she put me on the train. Said the lady would make sure it got to me when I reached my new home. Mason's instincts sharpened. What lady? Did you know her? No, she was pretty, with yellow hair. Sarah's brow furrowed in concentration. Mama called her Miss. Miss Winter, I think. Winters? Victoria Winters? Sarah's eyes widened. Yes, that's it. The lady who visits us. Mason sat down heavily. Victoria had known all along. She'd been in contact with Catherine, had helped send Sarah to him. Why hadn't she said anything? Uncle Mason, did I say something wrong? Mason forced a smile. No, little one. You didn't do anything wrong. I just need to have a talk with Miss Victoria, that's all. That evening, after Sarah was asleep, Mason sat by the fire examining the doll more closely. The secret compartment was well crafted. the seam nearly invisible when closed. Catherine had gone to great lengths to create this hiding place. But for what? A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Mason set the doll aside and moved cautiously to the window, peering out at the visitor. Victoria Winters stood on his porch, arms wrapped against the night chill. Mason opened the door. "We need to talk." Victoria stepped inside, unwinding her scarf. "I heard about your confrontation with Reed. The whole town's talking." "Not about that." Mason closed the door firmly. "About Catherine Bennett. About how you knew her." Victoria went still. "Who told you that?" "Sarah. Said her mother gave you the doll to bring to her. Said you were supposed to make sure it reached her new home." Mason's voice hardened. "You've been lying to me, Victoria, pretending to help when you knew everything all along." Victoria sighed, moving to the fire to warm her hands. "Not everything. And I wasn't lying, just waiting for the right time." "Now seems about right." Victoria turned to face him. "Catherine contacted me last summer. Said she was dying, that she needed to find a safe place for her daughter. She remembered that her sister had married and moved to Wyoming territory, but she'd lost touch years ago. Asked if I could help locate Margaret." "So you told her Margaret was dead?" "Yes. But I also told her about you." Victoria's eyes held his steadily. "I told her you were a good man who'd lost too much, that you lived alone on the ranch you'd built with her sister, that perhaps Sarah belonged with her uncle." Mason struggled to process this. "You arranged all this? The train, the depot, everything?" "Catherine arranged it. I just helped." Victoria pulled a letter from her pocket. "She asked me to give you this once Sarah was settled. I've been waiting for the right moment." Mason took the folded paper, recognizing a woman's handwriting similar to Margaret's. He opened it slowly as if it might contain something dangerous. "Dear Mr. Thornwood, by the time you read this, I will have joined my sister in whatever comes after this life. The doctors give me only weeks, and I cannot bear the thought of Sarah in an orphanage or with strangers who might not love her as she deserves. Margaret wrote to me of you often in her letters. She spoke of your strength, your honor, your capacity for love despite the darkness you carried from your past. Yes, I know you were once called the Falcon. Margaret told me everything. I have no right to ask anything of you, a man I've never met. But for my sister's sake, for the sake of the child who bears her eyes and my hair, I beg you to take in my Sarah. She is all that remains of our family, the best of Margaret and me combined in one small, brave soul. The doll contains papers that may help prove her lineage, her birth certificate, and my marriage license. I've sewn them into the secret compartment to keep them safe on her journey. The world is full of those who would take advantage of a child traveling alone. Please tell Sarah I loved her more than life itself, that sending her away was the hardest thing I've ever done, that I will watch over her always, alongside her Aunt Margaret." With deepest gratitude and hope, Catherine Bennett Mason lowered the letter, his vision blurred. "The papers, they're not in the doll." Victoria frowned. "What? They must be. Catherine showed them to me before she sewed them in." "The compartment is empty." Mason retrieved the doll, opening it to show her. "See for yourself." Victoria examined the hollow space, her expression troubled. "Someone must have found them and removed them, between Omaha and here. Or Reed got to them somehow." Mason closed the doll carefully. "He knows about Sarah, about her connection to me. If he found these papers, he'd destroy them," Victoria finished grimly, "to ensure you couldn't prove family continuity." Mason set the doll down, pacing the small room. "We need to find another way. Dr. Hayes said he delivered Sarah in Omaha, has medical records that might help. And Sullivan suggested a public branding ceremony. If Sarah participates in family trade with witnesses, that's legal proof of continuity." Victoria nodded. "It could work, but Reed won't make it easy." She hesitated. "Mason, there's something else you should know about the fire that killed Margaret." Mason went still. "What about it?" "There's something else you should know," Victoria said quietly. "Something I've kept to myself until now." Mason watched her, waiting. "Thomas saw Reed in Cheyenne the day of the fire. He was asking detailed questions about your schedule, when you'd be away from the ranch." Victoria's eyes were pained. "We didn't make the connection until Reed became land registrar and started seizing properties. By then, Thomas was gone, and I had no proof. Mason nodded slowly, the final piece clicking into place. Thank you for telling me now. Mason moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. Margaret's death had never felt like an accident. The stove had been well maintained, the chimney recently cleaned. But he'd buried his doubts along with his wife, unable to face the possibility that his past had reached out to destroy his present. We'll stop him, Mason said finally, his voice like iron. Not just for the land, for Margaret, for Sarah, for all of them. Victoria nodded, gathering her things to leave. The whole town's not against you, Mason. More people than you know remember what happened 15 years ago, when the Falcon cleared out the Rivers gang. They remember the peace that followed. After Victoria left, Mason sat with Catherine's letter, reading it again by the firelight. His wife's sister, a woman he'd never met, had entrusted him with her most precious possession, her child, had believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. He moved to Sarah's room, watching her sleep from the doorway. Her copper hair spread across the pillow, her small face peaceful in dreams. For 3 years he'd been existing, not living, allowing grief to wall him off from the world. Now this child had breached those walls, bringing with her complications and dangers. Yes, but also purpose. A reason to fight again. Mason returned to the main room and retrieved the old branding iron from the corner. Tomorrow, he'd take it to Parker for cleaning and sharpening. The iron needed to be ready by calving season, ready for small hands to grasp in front of the whole town. Reed thought he was targeting a broken man with nothing left to lose. He was wrong. Mason had something worth fighting for now. Something worth killing for, if it came to that. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. Snow began falling in the night, thick flakes that muffled sound and transformed the landscape into a blank canvas. Mason woke before dawn, the old habit of early rising ingrained after years of ranch work. He built up the fire, put coffee on to boil, and stood at the window watching daybreak struggle through the snowfall. His mind kept returning to Catherine's letter, to the missing papers, to Reed's threats. 60 days until May 1st, not much time to build a case strong enough to save the ranch. Behind him, he heard Sarah's bedroom door open, her small feet padding across the wooden floor. "It's snowing," she exclaimed, pressing her face to the glass beside him. "Can we make snow angels?" The simple request, so childlike and innocent amid his dark thoughts, caught Mason off guard. "Got chores first," he said gruffly. "Animals need tending, snow or no." Sarah's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I'll help." They ate a quick breakfast of biscuits left from the previous night, then bundled up against the cold. Outside, the world was transformed. Familiar shapes softened under a blanket of white, the barn a dark shadow against the swirling snow. As they made their way across the yard, Mason found himself scanning the tree line, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. Reed's threat about orphans disappearing echoed in his mind. He kept Sarah close, one hand protectively on her shoulder. The barn was dark and cold. Mason lit the lanterns while Sarah began spreading feed for the chickens that had taken shelter inside. The pregnant cows lowed softly in their stalls, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Uncle Mason," Sarah called, pointing to a dark corner. "There's a box over there. I can see something shiny." Mason followed her gaze to a wooden crate he'd shoved against the wall years ago. The lid had shifted, revealing something metallic inside. "Stay with the chickens," he instructed, moving to investigate. The crate contained things he'd packed away after Margaret's death. Items too painful to see, but too precious to discard. On top lay his gun belt, the leather cracked from disuse, the holster empty. But beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a matched pair of Colt revolvers, each engraved with a falcon in flight on the grip. Mason hadn't touched these weapons in 15 years, not since the day he buried the falcon and became Mason Thornwood, rancher and husband. He'd kept them as a reminder of who he'd been, of the debt he owed for the lives he'd taken, justified though they might have been. "Are those your guns from before?" Mason turned to find Sarah standing behind him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Thought I told you to stay with the chickens." "They're eating." Sarah moved closer, examining the weapons. "Are you the falcon that Mr. Franklin talked about? The one who saved people from bad men?" Mason should have been shocked by her perception, but somehow he wasn't. Children saw things adults missed, connections made through intuition rather than logic. That was a long time ago, he said finally. Another life. Sarah reached out, touching the falcon engraving with one small finger. Was Aunt Margaret afraid of you? Because of the guns? No, Mason wrapped the revolvers back in their cloth. She knew everything, accepted it all. Is that why the bad man burned your house? Because you were the falcon? Mason looked at her sharply. What do you know about that? Sarah shrugged. I heard Miss Victoria talking to you. Said a man named Reed hurt Aunt Margaret because of something from before. Mason closed the crate, gathering his thoughts. Sarah deserved the truth, a version of it at least. He sat on a hay bale, gesturing for her to join him. Long time ago, I hunted bad men for money, he began, choosing his words carefully. One of those men had brothers. I killed him because he'd hurt innocent people, but his brothers didn't see it that way. They wanted revenge, Sarah said solemnly, like in the stories. Yes, one of those brothers is Reed, the man from town who wants our land. He hurt Aunt Margaret to hurt you? Mason nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Sarah was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she asked, how many people did you save? Before? The question startled him. In all his years of carrying guilt for the lives he'd taken, he'd rarely thought about those he'd saved. I don't know. Never counted. Mr. Franklin said you saved him and Thomas. That's two. Sarah's expression was serious, calculating. And they had a family, so maybe that's 5 or 6 altogether? Despite everything, Mason felt a smile tug at his lips. Maybe so. And there were others too, right? That's a lot of people. Sarah looked up at him, her blue eyes, Margaret's eyes, holding his gaze steadily. More than the bad ones you had to stop. In that moment, with snow falling outside and his past literally laid bare between them, Mason felt something shift in him, a perspective he'd never allowed himself to consider. For 15 years, he'd seen the Falcon as a killer, a necessary evil he'd put behind him. But through Sarah's eyes, that man was something else, a protector, someone who'd stood between innocence and harm. Uncle Mason? Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Are you crying? He touched his cheek, surprised to find it wet. Just the cold, he lied, standing abruptly. Come on, we've got work to finish. They completed the morning chores in companionable silence, Mason lost in thoughts of the pond while Sarah hummed Margaret's lullaby. By the time they returned to the house, the snow was falling more heavily, the wind driving it horizontally across the yard. Storm's getting worse, Mason observed, helping Sarah out of her wet coat. Might be snowed in by nightfall. Sarah moved to the window, watching the swirling white. Will the animals be okay? They're sheltered, got food and water. Mason built up the fire, the familiar task steadying his hands. We'll check on them again before dark. Sarah remained at the window, her expression suddenly alert. Someone's coming. Mason joined her, peering through the thickening snow. A figure on horseback was approaching the ranch, barely visible through the white veil. Stay inside, Mason instructed, reaching for his coat. Lock the door behind me. Outside, the wind cut through his clothes like a knife, the cold finding every gap and seam. Mason shielded his eyes, trying to identify the approaching rider. The horse was struggling through the deepening snow, head down against the storm. As the rider drew closer, Mason recognized Sheriff Sullivan, his face half hidden by a scarf, his hat crusted with ice. Mason, Sullivan called over the wind. Need to talk. Mason gestured toward the barn, and they made their way through the blowing snow. Inside, Sullivan dismounted stiffly, his movements hampered by cold. Hell of a day for a social call, Mason observed, lighting a lantern. Sullivan unwound his scarf, revealing a face reddened by windburn. Wouldn't have come if it wasn't important. He stamped his feet, trying to restore circulation. Reed's making moves, fast ones. What kind of moves? He's filed papers with the territorial judge, claiming you've threatened him, that you're unfit to care for the girl. Sullivan pulled off his gloves, holding his hands toward a small brazier Mason kept for emergencies. Says he's got witnesses who will testify you forged documents to claim kinship. Mason's jaw tightened. Witnesses? Who? Doesn't say, but he's requested the judge expedite the review, Wants it done before the 60 days are up. Can he do that? Not without the judge's approval, and Judge Harmon's not due till late April. Sullivan's expression was grim, but Reed's got connections. Been sending telegrams to Cheyenne every day since your confrontation. Mason absorbed this, calculating what it meant for their timeline. So he's trying to move up the deadline, get the land before we can prove Sarah's family. That's part of it, Sullivan hesitated. There's more. Reed's hired men arrived on yesterday's train. 3 of them, staying at the hotel, look like hard cases, not the usual railroad surveyors. Gunmen, Mason said flatly. Sullivan nodded. I believe so, and they've been asking questions about your ranch, about your routines. The implications were clear. Reed wasn't willing to wait for legal channels. He was planning something that would ensure Mason never made it to the May 1st deadline. I appreciate the warning, Mason said. Sullivan studied him intently. What are you going to do? Mason thought of the revolvers in the crate, weapons he'd sworn never to use again. Whatever I have to. That's what I was afraid of. Sullivan rebuttoned his coat. Mason, listen to me. Reed wants you to become the Falcon again. Wants you to give him an excuse to act legally against you. And if he comes for Sarah? Sullivan had no answer for that. They both knew there were lines no man could allow to be crossed. Legal consequences be damned. Just be careful, Sullivan said finally. Town's divided. Some folks remember what you did for them years back, respect you for it. Others are afraid of Reed, afraid of losing their own land if they side with you. And where do you stand, Sheriff? Sullivan met his gaze steadily. 15 years ago, I was a deputy when the Rivers gang hit our town. They killed our sheriff, would have killed me too if the Falcon hadn't shown up when he did. He adjusted his hat. I haven't forgotten. After Sullivan left, Mason returned to the house, finding Sarah waiting anxiously by the door. Was it bad news? She asked immediately. Mason hung his coat, considering how much to tell her. Sheriff just wanted to check on us, make sure we're all right in the storm. Sarah accepted this with a child's trust, though her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. Can we work on the doll? I want to see if there's another secret place we missed. They spent the afternoon examining the doll inch by inch, searching for any hidden compartment or clue they might have overlooked. The snow continued falling, piling against the windows, until the light took on a strange, diffuse quality. It's getting dark early, Sarah observed as Mason lit the lamps. Are we going to check the animals again? I'll go. You stay inside where it's warm. But I want to help. Mason knelt before her, adjusting her collar with awkward tenderness. I need you to keep the fire going. That's helping too. She nodded reluctantly, and Mason headed back into the storm. The snow was mid-calf deep now, the wind driving it into drifts against the barn and corral. He fought his way across the yard, head bent against the biting cold. Inside the barn, the animals were restless, sensing the storm's unusual intensity. Mason checked their feed and water, speaking softly to calm them. As he worked, his mind kept returning to Sullivan's warning. Reed's gunman in town, asking questions, planning something. Mason moved to the crate in the corner, retrieving the wrapped revolvers. The weight of them was familiar in his hands, like greeting old friends. He checked each weapon methodically. Both were loaded, the mechanism still smooth despite years of disuse. He tucked one into his waistband, then wrapped the other and placed it inside his coat. The Falcon had been a man who anticipated trouble, who prepared for every contingency. Perhaps it was time for Mason Thornwood to do the same. As he made his way back to the house, a movement at the edge of the property caught his eye. Mason stopped, squinting through the falling snow. Nothing, just shadows and swirling white. But the Falcon had trusted his instincts, and those instincts were screaming now. Someone was watching the ranch. Someone who'd braved a blizzard to do so. Mason changed his course slightly, circling around to approach the house from a different angle. The wind covered the sound of his footsteps as he moved toward the tree line, hand on the revolver in his waistband. There, a darker shadow among the pines, a horse, steam rising from its nostrils, and beside it, a figure huddled in a heavy coat, a spyglass trained on the ranch house. Mason drew his weapon, approaching silently from behind. When he was just feet away, he spoke. Looking for someone? The figure whirled, hand dropping to a holster. Mason was faster, pressing the barrel of his Colt against the man's chest. I wouldn't. The man froze, his features coming into focus. Young, maybe 30, with a scar running from eye to jaw. One of Reed's hired guns, no doubt. Just passing through, the man said, his voice steady despite the gun at his chest. In a blizzard? Miles from the main road? Mason's tone was conversational, but his eyes were hard. Try again. The man's gaze flickered to the revolver, recognition dawning. That's a custom piece, Falcon engraving. His eyes lifted to Mason's face, to the scar at his temple. So it's true, you're him. Who I am doesn't matter. Why you're watching my ranch does. A thin smile spread across the scarred face. Reed said you'd be cautious. Said you'd spot us eventually. Us? Figure of speech. The man shrugged, seemingly unconcerned about the weapon still pressed to his chest. Reed paid good money to learn your routines. See when the girl's alone, that's all. Ice that had nothing to do with the storm formed in Mason's gut. You go back to Reed. Tell him anyone comes near my ranch, near the girl, won't leave alive. He figured you'd say something like that too. The man's smile widened. Said to tell you Margaret screamed real pretty when the house went up. Said the girl will too. The red haze that descended over Mason's vision was familiar. An old companion from his bounty hunting days. His finger tightened on the trigger, the urge to end this threat overwhelming. But Sarah's words from that morning echoed in his mind. How many people did you save? More than the bad ones you had to stop. With supreme effort, Mason lowered the revolver. Get on your horse, ride back to town, and tell Reed if he wants the Falcon, he's found him. The man hesitated, clearly surprised to be spared. Then he mounted quickly, disappearing into the swirling snow without another word. Mason stood watching until the rider was gone, the revolver heavy in his hand. The storm raged around him, but he barely felt it. Inside, a different storm was building, one made of rage and fear and the terrible certainty that this would end in blood. The Falcon, it seemed, had never truly died. He'd just been sleeping, waiting for the moment when Mason Thornwood would need him again. The blizzard raged through the night, shrieking around the cabin like a living thing. Mason sat by the window, revolver on his lap, watching the darkness for signs of movement. Sarah slept fitfully in her room, occasionally calling out in her sleep, dreams troubled by the howling wind or something deeper, Mason couldn't say. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Drifts reached the windowsills. Trees stood encased in ice that sparkled in the pale sunlight. The world looked clean, purified, a deception Mason knew too well. Can we go outside? Sarah asked, pressing her face to the glass. It's so pretty. After chores, Mason replied, pulling on his coat. Stay inside until I check the perimeter. Sarah's expression grew serious. Because of the bad men watching us? Mason paused at the door. What makes you say that? I saw you talking to someone in the trees yesterday. Sarah's eyes held his steadily. Before the snow got too thick to see. Mason considered denying it, protecting her from the truth, but decided against it. Yes, Reed sent someone to watch the ranch, but he's gone now. Will he come back? With others? Maybe. Mason crouched down, meeting her at eye level. That's why I need you to be extra careful. Don't go anywhere alone. Stay where I can see you. Sarah nodded solemnly. I'll be careful. Mason patted her shoulder awkwardly, still unaccustomed to physical displays of affection. Good girl, now I'm going to check the animals. Lock the door behind me. Outside, the cold air burned his lungs, but the sky was clear, a brilliant Wyoming blue that seemed to mock the dangers gathering around them. Mason trudged through knee-deep snow to the barn, alert for any sign of intruders. The encounter with Reed's scout had left him on edge, half expecting an ambush with each step. The animals had weathered the storm well, though they were restless from confinement. Mason fed and watered them, speaking low words of reassurance as he worked. In the cow stalls, he checked the pregnant heifers. They were growing heavy with calves, their sides swollen with new life. The first births were still weeks away, but Mason could see they'd be early this year. Calving season's coming, he told Sarah later, as they cleared a path from house to barn. We'll need to be ready. For the branding? Sarah asked, her small shovel barely making a dent in the snow. That's part of it. Mason paused, leaning on his shovel. Sarah, about that branding ceremony. It won't be easy. The whole town watching, judging, Reed there trying to stop us. Sarah straightened, brushing snow from her mittens. I know, but I can do it. You sure? Uncle Mason, she said with a child's directness, this is our home. I want to keep it. Our home. The simple phrase struck Mason like a physical blow. In just weeks, this orphaned girl had claimed the ranch as hers, had woven herself into the fabric of his life so completely he could hardly remember the solitude that came before. All right then, he said, blinking against the sudden brightness of sun on snow. We'll start practicing with the iron once Parker finishes reworking it. They spent the day clearing paths, checking fences, and securing the property against both weather and intruders. Mason moved the revolver from his coat to his belt, keeping it visible, a message to anyone watching that the Falcon was prepared. As evening approached, Mason caught sight of riders coming up the road from town. He tensed, hand moving to his weapon, but relaxed slightly when he recognized Victoria leading the group. Sarah, go inside, he instructed, eyes still on the approaching riders. But now, his tone brooked no argument. Sarah retreated to the house, though she remained watching through the window. Victoria rode at the head of a small procession, 5 wagons in total, each loaded with supplies. Behind her came the Franklins, Doc Hayes, and several other townspeople Mason recognized as allies. Brought provisions, Victoria called as they entered the yard. Figured you might need restocking after the storm. Mason approached cautiously, still wary. Quite a caravan for a supply run. Victoria dismounted, brushing snow from her skirts. That's not all we brought. She gestured to Hayes, who produced a leather folder from his saddlebag. Medical records, the doctor explained, joining them. Sarah's birth records from Omaha, proof of her parentage. I've petitioned Judge Harmon to review them as evidence of kinship, Franklin added, and we've all signed affidavits testifying to Sarah's presence here, her participation in ranch work. Mason looked from face to face, momentarily speechless at this show of support. Reed won't like this, he said finally. Reed can go to hell, Victoria replied bluntly. We're tired of watching him steal from widows and orphans. The visitors unloaded their supplies, food, medicines, ammunition, explaining that Reed had begun pressuring merchants to refuse service to Mason. This was their way of ensuring the ranch had what it needed for the coming weeks. There's more, Hayes said when the wagons were empty. Sullivan's found evidence Reed forged documents in previous land seizures. He's building a case, but needs more time. Time we might not have, Mason noted. That's why the branding ceremony is crucial, Victoria interjected. When is your first calf due? Soon, the storm might trigger early births. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Perfect timing. The ceremony needs to happen before May 1st, but after Judge Harmon arrives on April 28th. That gives him time to witness it personally. They moved inside where Sarah had already put coffee on to boil. The small cabin felt crowded with so many visitors, but strangely warmer for it, not just in temperature but in spirit. Franklin spread a map on the table, pointing out positions. Reed's men have been scouting along these ridges, 3 of them that we know of, possibly more. They won't try anything in town, Victoria added, but out here, isolated, you need to be vigilant. Mason studied the map, military tactics resurfacing from his bounty hunting days. They'll likely come from the north, through the tree line, harder to spot against the pines. Franklin nodded in agreement. My boy and I will take watch shifts. Between us, Sullivan, and a few others, we can maintain a perimeter. I can't ask you to risk yourselves, Mason protested. You didn't ask, Franklin replied simply. We offered. As the group discussed strategy, Sarah moved quietly among them, serving coffee with a dignity beyond her years. Mason watched her interact with their visitors, saw how naturally she filled the role of hostess, of family. The sight both warmed and terrified him. She belonged here, yes, but that belonging had placed her in danger. When the visitors departed as dusk approached, Mason walked Victoria to her wagon. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. Victoria adjusted her gloves, avoiding his eyes. I owed it to Margaret and to Catherine. Did you know about Reed, about who he really was when you helped Catherine send Sarah here? Victoria hesitated. I suspected. The timing of his arrival, his interest in your land specifically, it seemed too coincidental, but I didn't know for certain until recently. You put Sarah in danger. I put her with family, Victoria corrected firmly, where she belongs. Catherine knew the risks, knew Reed might come after you someday, but she believed you could protect Sarah better than anyone else. And if she was wrong, Victoria met his gaze directly. Then prove her right. After the visitors departed, Mason secured the cabin, checking locks and sight lines with the meticulous care of a man expecting trouble. Sarah watched from the hearth, the doll clutched to her chest. Are they coming tonight? She asked. The bad men? No, Mason lied, not wanting to frighten her further, just being cautious. Sarah wasn't fooled. I heard Mr. Franklin talking about guards and watches. That means danger. Mason sighed, setting aside the rifle he'd been cleaning. Yes, there's danger. Reed wants this land, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to get it. Because of revenge? For his brother? That's part of it. Mason joined her by the fire, the dancing flames reflecting in her eyes, Margaret's eyes. The land itself is valuable too. Railroad wants it for the water rights, the timber. Sarah considered this. What will happen at the branding ceremony? If we win? If Judge Harmon accepts it as proof of family continuity, the ranch stays ours. And if Sullivan's evidence against Reed is strong enough, Reed goes to jail. And if we lose? Mason had no answer that wouldn't frighten her more. Instead, he said, we won't lose, I promise. It was a promise he had no right to make, but the words seemed to comfort Sarah. She nodded, returning her attention to the doll in her lap. Uncle Mason, she said after a moment, can you teach me to shoot? In case the bad men come? The request chilled him more than the winter wind. A 7-year-old child shouldn't need to ask such things, shouldn't have to think about defending herself against grown men with guns. No, he said firmly, that's my job, protecting you. But what if you're not there? What if they come when you're checking the animals or in town? That's not going to happen. But what if it does? Sarah persisted. Mama taught me lots of things to be safe. She said sometimes adults can't protect you, so you have to know how to protect yourself. Mason studied her determined face, wondering what hardships she'd already endured in her young life. What had Catherine taught her daughter, knowing she was dying, knowing Sarah would face the world alone? Tell you what, he said finally, I'll teach you to hide. Show you places they won't find you if trouble comes. Better than shooting. Sarah seemed to accept this compromise. Like the root cellar? Mama had one in our house for tornadoes. Exactly, and I'll show you a signal so you'll know when it's safe to come out. They spent the next hour developing a safety plan, hiding places, escape routes, signals. Mason showed Sarah how to access the small cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards, a space barely large enough for a child but virtually invisible if you didn't know where to look. If you hear strangers, if something feels wrong, you hide here, Mason instructed. Don't come out until you hear 3 knocks, then my voice saying lavender. Lavender, Sarah repeated, like the flowers we planted on Aunt Margaret's grave. Yes, like those. After Sarah went to bed, Mason resumed his vigil by the window, revolver ready. The moon rose full and bright, turning the snow-covered landscape silver. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, peaceful. Now it just made potential attackers easier to spot. Hours passed, the fire burned low. Mason's thoughts wandered to Margaret, to the life they'd built together. He'd never imagined himself as a family man. His years as the Falcon had hardened him against such domestic dreams. But Margaret had seen something in him worth saving, worth loving. And now, improbably, he had a second chance at family with Sarah, if they survived what was coming. A soft noise from Sarah's room broke his reverie. Mason rose, moving quietly to her doorway. She was sitting up in bed, clutching the doll, tears streaming down her face. Bad dream? He asked softly. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. The men came, they took you away. I was all alone again. Mason entered, perching awkwardly on the edge of her bed. Just a dream. I'm right here. Promise you won't leave? Like Mama did? The simple question carried the weight of a child's deepest fear, abandonment. Sarah had already lost her mother, her home, everything familiar. Now she faced losing it all again. I can't promise nothing bad will happen, Mason said honestly, but I can promise I'll do everything possible to keep you safe, to keep our home. Sarah seemed to consider this, measuring his words against some internal standard of truth. Finally, she nodded, lying back down. Will you stay until I fall asleep? Mason nodded, settling more comfortably on the bed's edge. As Sarah's breathing slowed towards sleep, she began humming softly. Margaret's lullaby, the melody that had first connected them. Mason found himself joining her, his deep voice harmonizing with her childish soprano. The song filled the small room, chasing away shadows, creating a bubble of peace amid the gathering storm. In that moment, Mason understood what he was fighting for, not just land or justice or revenge, but this quiet moment of connection, this chance to be the protector Sarah needed, the man Catherine believed him to be, the husband Margaret had loved. For the first time in 15 years, he felt truly awake. The weeks that followed settled into a wary routine. During the day, Mason and Sarah continued ranch work, preparing for calving season. Franklin, or one of Sullivan's deputies, maintained a constant watch from the ridge overlooking the property, changing shifts at dawn and dusk. At night, Mason kept his vigil by the window, catching sleep in brief intervals when he felt it safe. Reed's men maintained their distance, visible occasionally through spyglasses on distant hills, but never approaching the ranch directly. Their presence was a constant reminder of the threat, a psychological warfare tactic Mason recognized from his Falcon days. The branding iron returned from Parker's forge, cleaned and sharpened, the MT star design clear and bold. Mason showed Sarah how to hold it, how to press it firmly against a calf's hide without wavering. They practiced daily with the cold iron, Sarah's determination growing with each session. The trick, Mason told her, is to be quick and confident. Don't hesitate once the iron touches hide. Sarah nodded, her small face serious as she mimicked the motion. With each practice session, her movements became more assured, more natural. They practiced daily, Sarah's movements becoming more assured with each session. Mason found himself impressed by her determination, her willingness to face the challenge despite her fears. Were you scared? She asked one afternoon as they repaired a fence line together. When you were the Falcon, hunting bad men? Mason paused, hammer in hand, considering the question. Yes, he admitted. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you alive. The trick is not letting it stop you from doing what needs doing. Sarah nodded, absorbing this. I'm scared about the branding ceremony. What if I mess up? What if everyone laughs? They won't laugh, Mason assured her. And if your hand shakes, I'll steady it. We'll do it together. This seemed to comfort her. She returned to holding nails as he hammered, working in companionable silence. Later that week, Hayes rode out with news. Judge Harmon had confirmed his arrival for April 28th, and Reed was pressuring the judge to expedite the land review. He's nervous, Hayes reported. Your allies in town have been gathering affidavits, testimonials about the forged documents. Sullivan's building a solid case. Will it be enough? Mason asked. Hayes shrugged. Depends on the judge. Harmon has a reputation for fairness, but Reed has connections in Cheyenne, influential friends. And the medical records? Will he accept them as proof of Sarah's lineage? I believe so. Birth records, surgical notes for her club foot correction, her mother's name clearly documented as Catherine Thornwood Bennett. Hayes glanced toward the barn where Sarah was gathering eggs. How's she doing with the branding practice? Better than expected. She's determined. Good, because Reed's determined too. He's been telling people you're unfit as a guardian, that you're using Sarah to hold onto the land, nothing more. Mason's jaw tightened. What do people believe? Some believe him. Others remember how you've changed since she arrived, participating in town events, attending church. Hayes smiled slightly. The surly widower becoming a family man makes a compelling story. After Hayes departed, Mason found Sarah in the chicken coop, stroking a broody hen with gentle fingers. She's going to have babies soon, Sarah observed, like the cows. That's right. Mason leaned against the doorframe, watching her. Doc Hayes says you're doing well with your club foot exercises. Says it's barely noticeable now. Sarah glanced down at her left foot. Mama said the doctors fixed it when I was a baby. That's how come I can run and climb like other children. Your mother made sure you got the care you needed. She was brave, like you. Sarah beamed at the comparison. Do you think she'd be proud of how I'm learning ranch work? I know she would. Mason hesitated, then added, Catherine's letter. She said you were the best of her and Margaret combined. She was right. Gura's eyes widened. You never told me what her letter said. Didn't want to make you sad thinking about her. Mason shifted uncomfortably. But you should know, she loved you more than anything. Sending you away was the hardest thing she ever did. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded bravely. I know. She told me she was sending me to family who would love me, who would keep me safe. She looked up at Mason. She meant you, didn't she? Even though we never met? Yes, Mason confirmed softly. She meant me. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah returned to the subject of her mother's doll. I still don't understand why the secret compartment was empty. Mama wouldn't make it for nothing. Mason had been pondering the same question. Reed's men might have found it, taken whatever was inside. Or maybe, Sarah turned the doll over in her hands, examining it with renewed interest. Maybe there's another secret place? Together, they inspected the doll inch by inch. The main compartment in the torso was obvious once you knew how to twist the head, but Sarah's persistence led them to a second, much smaller hiding space in the doll's left foot, the one corresponding to Sarah's own corrected club foot. Look! She worked her small fingers into the seam, revealing a tiny cavity containing a folded piece of paper. Mason unfolded it carefully. It was a marriage certificate, water-stained but legible. Catherine Thornwood and William Bennett, married June 12, 1875 in Omaha, Nebraska. At the bottom, barely visible, was Margaret's signature as witness. Mama hid it after all, Sarah whispered, awe in her voice. 2 hiding places, not just one. Mason examined the document. It wasn't proof of Sarah's birth, but it established Catherine's connection to the Thornwood family, her status as Margaret's sister. Combined with Hayes's medical records, it might be enough to convince Judge Harmon. This could help us, Sarah. This could really help. Sarah smiled, tracing her mother's name on the certificate. She knew I'd find it. She made the doll special, with 2 secrets. Mason carefully refolded the certificate. Tomorrow he'd ride into town, show Sullivan and Hayes what they'd found. Another piece of evidence to strengthen their case. But first there was something he needed to do, something long overdue. Come with me, he said, rising and offering Sarah his hand. There's something I want to show you. He led her to the trunk in his bedroom, the one he'd kept locked since Margaret's death. Inside were his most precious possessions, Margaret's jewelry, their wedding photograph, letters she'd written him during his cattle drives. These belonged to your Aunt Margaret, Mason explained, lifting out a small wooden box. I think she'd want you to have something from it. Inside the box lay a silver locket, simple but elegant, engraved with intertwined roses. Mason opened it to reveal a tiny portrait of Margaret on one side, and on the other a younger woman with Sarah's copper hair, Catherine. That's Mama, Sarah exclaimed, touching the tiny image reverently. Margaret kept this with her always, Mason said, placing the chain around Sarah's neck. Sisters, together. Now you can keep them both close. Sarah clutched the locket, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you, Uncle Mason. Later, after Sarah was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table with Catherine's marriage certificate, studying Margaret's signature. His wife had witnessed her sister's wedding, had maintained that connection despite whatever estrangement had separated them. Had Margaret known about Sarah's birth? Had she tried to tell him, only to have him half listen, distracted by ranch concerns? The thought brought a familiar ache of regret. So many conversations he'd missed, so many moments lost to his own preoccupation. Margaret had deserved better. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Mason moved silently to the window, revolver ready, then relaxed slightly when he recognized Sullivan's silhouette. You're out late, Sheriff, Mason observed, opening the door. Sullivan stepped inside, removing his hat. His expression was grave. Rode out as soon as I could without being followed. Reed's making his move, Mason. What move? He's called in more men. 6 riders arrived on tonight's train, armed to the teeth. Sullivan accepted the coffee Mason offered, warming his hands on the mug. Word is they're planning something before the judge arrives. Reed's getting desperate. Mason absorbed this news, calculating what it meant for their timeline. How many days till Judge Harmon gets here? 5, but I don't think Reed plans to wait that long. Sullivan lowered his voice, glancing toward Sarah's room. Mason, you should consider sending the girl somewhere safe. Victoria's offered to take her to her sister's place in Cheyenne until this is over. The suggestion made practical sense. Sarah would be out of danger, away from whatever violence Reed was planning. But Mason knew what it would mean to her. Another abandonment, another adult breaking promises of protection. No, he said firmly. She stays with me. We face this together. Sullivan studied him, then nodded slowly. Thought you might say that. That's why I brought this. He reached into his coat, producing a folded paper. Judge Harmon sent it ahead. Preliminary adoption approval, pending the final hearing. Makes you Sarah's legal guardian in the interim. Mason took the document, reading it by lamplight. It wasn't the final answer, but it was official recognition of his relationship with Sarah, something Reed couldn't easily dismiss. This helps, he acknowledged, but Reed won't care about papers. He wants me gone one way or another. I know. That's why we're accelerating the timeline. Sullivan leaned forward. First calf was born at the Henderson place yesterday. Yours won't be far behind. Once you have a calf, we hold the branding ceremony immediately. Don't wait for Judge Harmon. Get the witnesses, make it official, document everything. And Reed's gunman? I've deputized Franklin and 4 others. They'll provide security during the ceremony. Sullivan's eyes were hard. Anyone starts trouble, they'll answer to the law. After Sullivan departed, Mason resumed his vigil by the window. The night was clear, stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamond dust. Somewhere out there, Reed's men were watching, planning, waiting for the moment to strike. Mason checked his revolvers, the familiar weight comforting in his hands. The Falcon had been a hunter, a man who sought out confrontation. Mason Thornwood would prefer peace, but he would not hesitate to protect what was his. In the darkness, he made a silent vow, to Margaret, to Catherine, to Sarah. Whatever came, whatever price he had to pay, Sarah would keep her home. She would not be unwanted or abandoned again, even if it cost him everything. Dawn broke with a restless energy that Mason felt in his bones. The pregnant cows were agitated, pacing their stalls, showing the early signs of labor. Calving season had arrived. Stay close to the house today, he instructed Sarah as they finished breakfast. First calves could come any time, and I'll need to be in the barn. Sarah nodded, clearing the dishes with practiced efficiency. Can I help when they come? You can bring clean rags and water if I call for them. Otherwise, stay inside where it's safe. She seemed to understand the unspoken concern. Reed's men might use the distraction of calving to make their move. I'll watch from the window. If I see strangers, I'll hide in the cellar like we practiced. Mason nodded, grateful for her maturity. Good girl. The morning passed in tense anticipation. Mason moved between the barn and the house, checking the pregnant cows, then returning to make sure Sarah was safe. By midday, the first heifer was in active labor, her sides heaving with the contractions. Mason sent Sarah for clean water and rags, then settled in for the delicate work of bringing new life into the world. The heifer was young, a first-time mother struggling with the process. Mason had to intervene, reaching into the birth canal to guide the calf's front legs into position. Sarah watched from a safe distance, her eyes wide as the calf finally emerged in a rush of fluid and effort. The tiny creature lay motionless on the straw. Is it dead? Sarah whispered. Mason cleared mucus from the calf's nose and mouth, then rubbed its chest vigorously with straw. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the calf gasped, its small rib cage expanding with its first breath. He's alive, Mason confirmed, continuing to rub the calf dry. Just needed some help getting started. Sarah crept closer, watching in fascination as the mother cow began licking her newborn, her rough tongue stimulating its circulation. Within minutes, the calf was attempting to stand on wobbly legs. He's trying to walk already, Sarah marveled. Has to, Mason explained, washing his hands in the bucket she'd brought. Out on the range, calves need to be mobile quick. Predators target the weak. The heifer finally helped her calf find its way to her udder, where it began nursing eagerly. Mason stepped back, allowing mother and baby space to bond. Sarah remained transfixed by the scene, her expression a mixture of wonder and contemplation. That's how it starts, Mason told her. In a few days, once he's strong enough, we'll brand him, mark him as part of our herd. Our family, Sarah corrected softly, and Mason found himself nodding in agreement. The rest of the day brought 2 more births, both proceeding without complications. Mason sent word to town with Franklin's son, that the calving had begun, knowing Sullivan would understand the significance. The branding ceremony could now be scheduled. By evening, Mason was exhausted but satisfied. 3 healthy calves, all nursing well, all candidates for the first public branding. He cleaned up and headed to the house, looking forward to a hot meal and rest. The sight that greeted him at the door froze his blood. The front window was shattered, glass littering the porch. The door hung partially open, splintered around the lock. "Sarah." Mason drew his revolver, approaching cautiously. "Sarah, answer me." Silence. He entered the cabin with weapon raised, scanning for threats. The main room was in disarray. Table overturned, chairs broken, signs of a struggle. But no Sarah. "Sarah!" Mason moved quickly through the small house, checking her bedroom, finding it empty. He returned to the main room, heart hammering. Had Reed's men taken her? Was this the move Sullivan had warned about? Then he remembered. The cellar. He'd trained her to hide there if danger came. Mason lifted the concealed trapdoor beneath the kitchen floorboards, revealing the small space below. "Sarah, it's me, Lavender." A small, terrified face peered up from the darkness. "Uncle Mason?" Relief flooded through him as he helped her climb out. She was shaking, her dress torn at the shoulder, a bruise forming on her cheek. "What happened?" he demanded, checking her for other injuries. "Who did this?" "2 men," Sarah whispered. "They came while you were in the barn with the 3rd calf. Said they were looking for papers, for proof about me." Her voice broke. "I ran to hide like you taught me, but one of them caught my dress. I kicked him and got away." Mason's relief transformed into cold rage. "Did they hurt you?" "He hit me when I kicked him." Sarah touched her bruised cheek. "Then they started breaking things, looking for papers. I heard them say Mr. Reed sent them to find evidence." Mason gathered her into his arms, an awkward but fierce embrace. "You did exactly right. You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Mason knew they weren't true. No one was safe while Reed's men roamed free, bold enough to attack a child in her own home. "Pack a bag," he instructed, setting her down. "Just essentials. We're going to town." Sarah's eyes widened. "Are we running away?" "No," Mason assured her, loading his shotgun with practiced efficiency. "We're done running, done hiding. It's time Reed understood what happens when you threaten a man's family." Within 30 minutes, they were on the road to Coldwater, Sarah riding double with Mason. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson. They rode in tense silence, Mason scanning the terrain for signs of ambush, Sarah clinging to his back. Victoria met them at the boarding house, her expression grave as she took in Sarah's bruised face and Mason's thunderous countenance. "Reed's men?" she asked, ushering them inside. Mason nodded curtly. "Broke into the house while I was tending calves, looking for documents, proof of Sarah's lineage." Victoria guided Sarah to a chair by the fire, examining her injuries with gentle hands. "Did they find anything?" "No," Sarah had the marriage certificate with her. Mason patted his coat pocket where the document now rested, and she hid before they could grab her. "Brave girl," Victoria murmured, applying witch hazel to Sarah's bruise. "You'll stay here tonight. Both of you. It's safer with numbers." Mason didn't argue. The boarding house was more defensible than his isolated cabin, and Sarah needed the comfort of Victoria's motherly presence after her ordeal. "I need to find Sullivan," he said, moving toward the door. "Let him know what happened." "He's already here," Victoria replied. "In the parlor with Hayes and Franklin. They're finalizing plans for the branding ceremony." Mason found the men gathered around a map of the town, marking positions and sight lines. They looked up as he entered, their expressions shifting as they registered his mood. "Reed's men made their move," Sullivan stated, reading Mason's face. "The girl?" "Safe but shaken. They broke into the house, searching for documents." Hayes swore softly. "Bastards. Attacking a child." "This changes things," Franklin observed. "They're getting bolder." Sullivan nodded grimly, "which means we accelerate our timeline. The branding ceremony happens tomorrow, not in 5 days. We can't wait for Judge Harmon." "Tomorrow," Mason frowned. "The calves are just born. They should have a few days to strengthen." "We don't have a few days," Sullivan countered. "Reed's men will try again, maybe worse next time. We need to establish Sarah's legal position immediately, create witnesses and documentation that even Reed can't ignore. Mason knew Sullivan was right. Reed had crossed a line by targeting Sarah directly. The time for caution was past. Tomorrow then, he agreed. First light, the strongest calf. We'll have witnesses, Franklin promised. Half the town is ready to stand with you. And the other half? Mason asked. Sullivan's expression was grim. With Reed or too scared to choose sides. But we'll have enough. 20, 30 people at least. And armed deputies, Hayes added, to ensure no interference. They spent the next hour planning security for the ceremony. The branding would take place at Mason's ranch, in the corral where the entire town could witness it. Sullivan would position deputies at key points to prevent disruption. Hayes would document the ceremony officially, creating a legal record for Judge Harmon's review. When the meeting concluded, Mason returned to Victoria's kitchen, where Sarah sat drinking hot chocolate, the bruise on her cheek darkening despite Victoria's ministrations. All set for tomorrow? Victoria asked. Mason nodded, taking a seat beside Sarah. You up for this, little one? After today, no one would blame you for wanting to wait. Sarah straightened in her chair, a determined light in her eyes. Margaret's eyes. I'm ready. Those men tried to scare us, but I'm not scared. She touched her bruised cheek. Well, maybe a little, but I can still do it. Mason felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. This child, who'd lost everything and endured so much, still found courage to stand her ground. Get some rest, he told her. Tomorrow's an important day. That night, Mason slept fitfully in a chair by Sarah's door, revolver in his lap. The boarding house creaked and settled around him, the familiar sounds of other lives proceeding nearby, oddly comforting after weeks of isolated vigilance at the ranch. His thoughts kept returning to Reed's men ransacking his home, to Sarah hiding in terror, to the bruise on her small face. The falcon stirred within him, that cold, calculating hunter who tracked men across Wyoming's vastness and delivered final justice. Mason had buried that part of himself when he married Margaret, had promised her and himself that the falcon's days of bloodshed were done. But now, with Sarah threatened, with everything he loved at risk, he felt the old instincts resurface, sharp and deadly as a raptor's talons. If Reed wanted the falcon, he would find him. Tomorrow at the branding ceremony, before the whole town. One way or another, this would end. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sky a pale blue promising fair weather. Mason woke Sarah gently, helping her dress in her warmest clothes. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight, a purple stain against her pale skin. Does it hurt? He asked, touching it gently. A little, she admitted, but I can still do the branding. Victoria provided a hearty breakfast, though neither Mason nor Sarah had much appetite. The boarding house buzzed with activity as townspeople gathered, preparing to accompany them to the ranch. By 7 o'clock, a procession had formed. Wagons, riders, people on foot, all headed toward the Thornwood homestead. Mason and Sarah rode at the front alongside Sullivan, who had deputized 6 men for the occasion, their badges gleaming in the morning sun. Any sign of Reed or his men? Mason asked as they crested the hill overlooking his property. Sullivan shook his head. Nothing yet, but they'll come. The ranch appeared undisturbed in the morning light, though Mason noted with grim satisfaction that Franklin's sons had boarded up the broken window and repaired the door during the night. In the barn, the newborn calves nursed from their mothers, unaware of the drama about to unfold around them. Mason selected the strongest calf, a sturdy male born first the previous day. With Franklin's help, he separated mother and baby, securing the calf to the branding post in the center of the corral. Parker, the blacksmith, had already begun heating the iron in a small forge, the MT star design glowing orange as the temperature rose. The townspeople positioned themselves around the corral, some standing on the lower rails for a better view. Victoria took charge of Sarah, helping her put on leather gloves to protect her small hands from the heat. Hayes stood nearby, official documents ready for witnesses to sign after the ceremony. Mason surveyed the gathering. 20, maybe 30 people had come to support them. He recognized faces from church, merchants who'd extended credit during lean years, neighbors who'd participated in cattle drives and barn raisings. But others were conspicuously absent, those who feared Reed's influence, or believed his accusations. "Ready?" Victoria asked, bringing Sarah forward. Mason crouched before the girl, meeting her eyes directly. "Remember what we practiced. Hold the iron steady, press firm, count to 3, lift straight up. I'll be right beside you, guiding your hands if needed." Sarah nodded, her expression solemn. "I remember." Sullivan approached, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. "No sign of Reed yet, but my deputies report riders approaching from the north. At least 8 men moving fast." "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe less." Sullivan's gaze swept the gathering crowd. "We should start now, get it done before they arrive." Mason nodded, straightening. "Parker, is the iron ready?" The blacksmith tested the brand's temperature, then nodded. "Hot enough to mark, not so hot it'll burn too deep. Perfect for a first branding." Mason addressed the assembled witnesses, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet yard. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, this ceremony establishes Sarah Bennett as my legal ward and blood relation through her mother, Catherine Thornwood Bennett, sister to my late wife, Margaret." Hayes stepped forward, holding up documents. "I have medical records confirming Sarah's birth to Catherine Thornwood Bennett, as well as their marriage certificate. These establish blood relation according to territorial law." Mason continued, "Today, Sarah will participate in the family trade by branding our new calf with the Thornwood mark. This confirms family continuity as required by law." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Sarah stood straight beside Mason, her small face composed despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. Parker removed the branding iron from the fire, the metal glowing a dull orange. He approached carefully, holding it out handle first. Parker handed Sarah the gloves and the heated iron. The weight was challenging for her small arms, but her grip was firm, her jaw set with determination that reminded Mason so much of Margaret. Mason positioned himself behind her, ready to assist if needed, though something told him she wouldn't falter. Together they approached the calf, which strained against its restraints, sensing danger. Franklin and his son held the animal steady as Sarah positioned the brand above its flank. "Now, Sarah," Mason instructed softly, "press firm and steady." Sarah lowered the iron to the calf's hide. The animal bellowed once as the hot metal made contact, the smell of burning hair and skin filling the air. Sarah's voice rang clear over the calf's protest. "MT Star, this is my family's mark." She held the iron steady for 3 seconds, then lifted it cleanly away. The brand was perfect, clear lines forming the MT inside a 5-pointed star. A cheer erupted from the assembled witnesses. Victoria wiped tears from her eyes while Hayes nodded in approval, already preparing the documentation. Sarah handed the iron back to Parker, her face flushed with accomplishment despite her obvious discomfort at the calf's distress. "You did it," Mason told her, pride evident in his voice. "Perfect branding." Before Sarah could respond, Sullivan's voice cut through the celebration. "Riders coming! Everyone take positions!" The crowd parted as Reed and his men rode into the yard, dust rising from their horses' hooves despite the morning chill. Reed sat his mount at the center, flanked by hard-faced men with hands resting on holstered weapons. "Well, well," Reed called, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Quite a gathering, and just in time to witness fraud in progress." Sullivan stepped forward, hand on his badge. "This is a legal branding ceremony, Reed, with witnesses and documentation. The girl has established family continuity." Reed's smile was cold. "The girl is no relation to Thornwood. We all know it. This charade won't stand up to proper legal scrutiny." Hayes moved to Sullivan's forty, holding up his folder. "I have medical records proving Sarah's mother was Catherine Thornwood Bennett, sister to Margaret Thornwood. Blood relation is established." "Forgeries," Reed dismissed with a wave. "Like everything else Thornwood has presented." Mason kept Sarah behind him, shielded from Reed's view. The gathered townspeople had gone silent, watching the confrontation with tense anticipation. Reed dismounted, approaching the corral fence. His men remained on horseback, spread out in a semicircle that effectively surrounded the gathering. "I'll make this simple," Reed announced. "The land review proceeds as scheduled. The girl goes to county care while her status is investigated. Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstructing official county business." "You have no authority here," Sullivan countered. "Judge Harmon arrives in 4 days. He'll make the final determination." I am the county land registrar, Reed's voice hardened. The law gives me authority to conduct preliminary assessments. The law doesn't authorize attacking children, Victoria called out, stepping forward to reveal Sarah's bruised face to the crowd. Your men did this yesterday while searching Thornwood's home illegally. A murmur of shock and anger rippled through the assembled townspeople. Reed's expression flickered briefly before his composure returned. I authorized a legal search for documents. Any injuries were likely self-inflicted to gain sympathy. Reed's gaze shifted to Mason. Thornwood's deception has gone on long enough. This ends today. Mason felt something shift inside him, the final transformation from Mason Thornwood, grieving widower, to the full integration of both his past and present selves. The Falcon's calculating precision merged with Thornwood's protective instincts, creating something new and resolute. You're right about one thing, Rivers, Mason said, using Reed's true name for the first time publicly. This ends today. A hush fell over the gathering, Reed's face drained of color at the use of his real name. Joseph Rivers, Mason continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the yard. Brother of James Rivers, the last member of the Rivers gang I brought to justice 15 years ago. Sullivan picked up the thread. Joseph Rivers, wanted in 3 territories for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder, including the fire that killed Margaret Thornwood 3 years ago. Reed's hand moved toward his coat, but Sullivan's deputies had their weapons trained on him and his men. These are lies, Reed sputtered, but the conviction had left his voice. I have evidence, Sullivan continued, producing documents from his coat. Financial records showing how you used your position to seize homesteads and sell them to the railroad at profit. Witness statements about forged signatures. And most damning, a sworn affidavit from one of your own men confessing you ordered Margaret Thornwood's murder as revenge against the Falcon. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Reed backed toward his horse, signaling his men. This is obstruction of justice. I am a county official. Not anymore, Sullivan replied, producing handcuffs. Joseph Rivers, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and the murder of Margaret Thornwood. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of moments Mason had experienced in his bounty hunting days. Time seeming to slow, details sharpening with preternatural focus. Reed drew a hidden derringer from his coat sleeve. His arm rose, the small pistol aimed not at Sullivan or Mason, but at Sarah, who stood partially exposed behind Victoria. If I can't have the land, Reed snarled, neither will the Falcon's brat. Mason moved with instincts long dormant, but never lost. His revolver cleared its holster as he stepped into Reed's line of fire, placing himself between the gun and Sarah. His first shot caught Reed in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Reed's men reacted instantly, weapons appearing in their hands. Sullivan and his deputies returned fire, the peaceful ceremony erupting into chaos. Townspeople screamed, diving for cover as bullets splintered wood and kicked up dust. Mason felt a burning impact in his side but remained standing, focused solely on Reed, who was scrambling toward his horse despite his wound. Mason's second shot missed as Reed ducked behind a water trough. Get Sarah to safety, Mason shouted to Victoria, advancing on Reed's position. Franklin appeared at his side, rifle ready. I'm with you, Falcon. Together, they flanked the water trough, catching Reed as he attempted to flee toward the tree line. Mason's third shot caught him in the leg, dropping him to the ground. Reed rolled onto his back, the derringer still clutched in his hand. Mason kicked the weapon away, standing over the man who had destroyed so much. You killed her, Mason said, his voice deadly quiet. You burned my wife alive because of a 15-year-old vendetta. Reed's laugh was a breathless, pained sound. She screamed your name, Falcon, begged for you to save her. The red haze descended over Mason's vision, his revolver rising for a final shot. In that moment, Margaret's face flashed before him, followed by Sarah's, 2 pairs of identical blue eyes watching, judging. With supreme effort, Mason lowered his weapon. You don't get to die so easily, Rivers. You'll stand trial for what you've done. You'll hang with witnesses legal and proper. Sullivan arrived, securing Reed with handcuffs despite his wounds. Around them, the gunfight had ended. Reed's men either fled, wounded, or captured by Sullivan's deputies. Mason, Sullivan said urgently, you're hit. Mason looked down, noticing for the first time the blood seeping through his shirt, The bullet had caught him in the side, a burning pain he'd ignored in the heat of battle. "It's nothing," he began, but the world suddenly tilted sideways. Franklin caught him as his knees buckled, lowering him gently to the ground. "Doc Hayes!" Franklin shouted. "Mason's down!" As consciousness faded, Mason heard Sarah's voice calling his name, felt small hands clutching his. His last thought before darkness claimed him was of promises kept and battles won, of a brand perfectly applied and a family finally secured. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, the world around him a blur of voices and shadows. He caught fragments, Hayes' barking orders, Sarah's tearful pleas, Victoria's firm reassurances. The pain in his side flared with each heartbeat, but it was distant, as if happening to someone else. When he finally surfaced fully, he was in an unfamiliar bed. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains he didn't recognize, casting dappled patterns across a quilt he'd never seen. Victoria's guest room, he realized hazily. "Uncle Mason?" Sarah's voice, small and hopeful. He turned his head with effort. She sat in a chair beside the bed, her copper hair neatly braided, her blue eyes, Margaret's eyes, wide with concern. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish smudge. "How long?" His voice was a rasp. "3 days," Sarah replied, reaching for a cup of water on the nightstand. She helped him drink, her small hand steady. "Doc Hayes said the bullet went clean through. No vital organs hit. You were lucky." Lucky. Mason wasn't sure that was the word he'd choose. The memory of the gunfight returned in fragments. Reed's derringer aimed at Sarah, the chaos of gunfire, the burning impact in his side. "Reed?" he asked. "Sheriff Sullivan has him locked up," Sarah said. "His men too, the ones who didn't run away. Miss Victoria says they'll stand trial soon." Mason tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged wound. Sarah pushed him gently back against the pillows. "Doc Hayes said you have to rest," she scolded, with a seriousness beyond her years, "or you'll start bleeding again." The door opened and Victoria entered, carrying a tray with steaming broth. Her face softened with relief when she saw Mason awake. "About time," she said briskly, setting the tray on the bedside table. "We were beginning to think you planned to sleep through Judge Harmon's arrival." "The judge," Mason started. "Is here," Victoria confirmed. "Arrived yesterday, ahead of schedule. News of the shooting reached him in Cheyenne, and he rode straight through." She adjusted the pillows behind Mason, helping him sit up enough to eat. "He's reviewing all the evidence. The branding ceremony, Hayes' medical records, Catherine's marriage certificate, Sullivan's case against Reed." Sarah took the bowl of broth from Victoria, insisting on feeding Mason herself. He submitted to her ministrations, too weak to argue and secretly touched by her determination to care for him. "The whole town's been coming by," Sarah informed him between spoonfuls. "Mr. Franklin and his sons fixed our house. Mrs. Hobbs brought peas. Even Parker made you a new rocking chair." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "And Sheriff Sullivan says you're a hero." Mason caught Victoria's eye over Sarah's head. "The land?" Victoria understood his unspoken question. "Safe," she assured him. "Judge Harmon issued a preliminary ruling yesterday. The branding ceremony established family continuity beyond doubt. Even without the official adoption papers, Sarah's status as your bloodkin is recognized." Relief flooded through Mason, washing away the last of his haziness. They'd won. The ranch would remain theirs, his and Sarah's. "You should have seen her," Victoria continued, a note of pride in her voice. "Standing before the judge, telling him exactly how you taught her to brand, how you saved her from Reed's men." She smiled at Sarah. "Bravest testimony I've ever witnessed." Sarah blushed, ducking her head. "I just told the truth." A knock at the door announced Hayes' arrival for his daily examination. The doctor's face broke into a rare smile when he saw Mason conscious. "Welcome back," he said, setting his bag on the bed. "You had us worried for a while there." The examination was thorough but quick. Hayes pronounced himself satisfied with Mason's progress, though he ordered at least another week of bed rest. "The wound's clean, no infection," he reported. "You'll have a scar to match the one on your temple, but you'll live." "When can he come home?" Sarah asked anxiously. Hayes considered. "If he behaves himself, maybe 3 or 4 days. But no riding, no heavy lifting for at least a month." I'll see to it, Sarah promised solemnly, drawing smiles from the adults. After Hayes departed, Sullivan arrived, his expression grave but satisfied. He took the chair Sarah vacated, waving off her offer to leave them alone. She deserves to hear this too, Sullivan told Mason. She's as much a part of it as any of us. The sheriff removed his hat, turning it in his hands. Reed, or Rivers, I should say, has confessed to everything. The forgeries, the land fraud, ordering the fire that killed Margaret. He glanced at Sarah, then back to Mason. Seems he wanted you to know it was him before they hang him. When's the trial? Mason asked. 2 weeks from now, Judge Harmon's presiding. Sullivan's mouth tightened. It won't take long. We've got more than enough evidence, even without his confession. 23 counts of fraud, 12 of forgery, and murder. Victoria guided Sarah to the window, giving the men a moment of privacy. Sullivan leaned closer to Mason, lowering his voice. There's something else, and he said, and something Reed told me that you should know. He hesitated. It's about Margaret. Mason braced himself. Tell me. She knew who Reed was, Sullivan said quietly, the day of the fire. He told her before he said it. Wanted her to know why she was dying. Mason's hands clenched in the bed covers. Why are you telling me this? Because of what she said to him. Sullivan's eyes held Mason steadily. According to Reed, her last words were that she forgave you, that she'd always known this day might come, but she never regretted a single moment with you. The room seemed to tilt around Mason. Margaret had known, had faced her killer with the knowledge that her death was payment for a debt incurred long before they met, and still she had forgiven him. Uncle Mason? Sarah had returned to his side, her small hand finding his. Are you okay? He looked at her, this child who carried Margaret's eyes and Catherine's courage, who'd survived loss and fear and still found the strength to claim a place in his heart. Yes, he said, squeezing her hand gently. I'm okay. The days that followed brought a steady stream of visitors. The Franklins, the Hobbs, Hayes, Parker, all coming to check on Mason's recovery and share news of the town's transformation. Reed's confession had exposed the full extent of his crimes, revealing that nearly a third of the county's land had been illegally seized and resold to the railroad. Judge Harmon had ordered immediate restoration of all properties to their rightful owners. Victoria's boarding house was returned to her ownership, along with the 12 other homesteads Reed had stolen. The railroad company, disavowing any knowledge of Reed's schemes, was facing its own investigation. A week after Mason regained consciousness, Judge Harmon himself came to visit. The judge was a lean, gray-haired man with piercing eyes and a reputation for fairness. He declined Victoria's offer of tea, getting straight to business. Mr. Thornwood, he said, settling into the chair beside Mason's bed, I've reviewed all the evidence in your case, as well as Sheriff Sullivan's investigation of Joseph Rivers. He produced a document from his coat pocket. I've issued my final ruling on the matter of your homestead. Mason accepted the paper, reading it carefully. It confirmed what Victoria had already told him. The ranch was legally his, with Sarah recognized as blood relation and legal heir. Thank you, Your Honor, Mason said, folding the document. There's more, Harmon said, producing a second paper. This is the adoption decree. Makes Sarah Bennett officially Sarah Thornwood, your legal daughter in all respects. He handed it to Mason. Just needs your signature. Mason stared at the document, momentarily overwhelmed. Daughter, not just niece or ward. The word carried weight, responsibility, commitment. Sarah, he called softly. She appeared in the doorway, clearly having been listening from the hallway. Her eyes widened when she saw the paper in Mason's hand. Come here, Mason said. She approached hesitantly, looking between him and the judge. What is it? Judge Harmon's brought adoption papers, Mason explained. If I signed these, you'd be Sarah Thornwood, my daughter legally. Sarah's breath caught. Really? Mason nodded. But only if that's what you want. You'd still be Catherine's daughter too. Nothing changes that. I know. Sarah's voice was barely audible. But I'd be yours too. You already are, Mason said simply. This just makes it official. Sarah launched herself at him, heedless of his wound, wrapping her arms around his neck. Yes, she whispered against his shoulder. Please. Judge Harmon produced a pen, an indulgent smile softening his stern features. Mason signed with a steady hand, then helped Sarah add her own careful signature below his. Congratulations, Miss Thornwood, Harmon said, stamping the document and returning it to his pocket for filing. The adoption is effective immediately. After the judge departed, Sarah remained perched on the edge of Mason's bed, her expression thoughtful. "What is it?" Mason asked. "I was just thinking about Mama," she replied, "and Aunt Margaret. Do you think they'd be happy about this?" Mason thought of Catherine's letter, of Margaret's diary entries, of Sullivan's revelation about Margaret's final words. "Yes," he said with certainty. "I think they'd be very happy." 20 years later, the lavender bloomed thick across the hillside, its scent carried on the warm June breeze. Mason sat on the porch of the Thornwood ranch house, his weathered hands resting on the arms of the rocking chair Parker had made him 2 decades ago. At 78, his once silver hair was now snow white, his face a map of lines earned through years of Wyoming winters and summer sun. From his vantage point, he could see the entire ranch spread before him, the barn and corral he'd built with his own hands, the garden Margaret had started and Sarah had expanded, the new guest cabin added 5 years ago when the grandchildren began arriving in quick succession. In the corral, Sarah stood beside her oldest daughter, Margaret, named for the aunt she'd never met. At 12, young Margaret had her mother's copper hair and her grandmother's blue eyes, a living bridge between generations of Thornwood women. "Steady," Sarah instructed, adjusting Margaret's grip on the branding iron. "Remember, confidence is the key. If your hand shakes, the brand blurs," Margaret finished, her expression one of intense concentration. "I know, Ma." Mason smiled, recognizing the same determination Sarah had shown at the fateful branding ceremony 20 years ago. That day had changed everything, had transformed a broken widower and an unwanted orphan into a family bound by choice as much as blood. Sarah was 37 now, a confident woman who ran the ranch with the same quiet efficiency Margaret once had. She'd married Thomas Franklin, Walter's youngest son, 15 years ago. Their 3 children, Margaret, William, and Catherine, had brought laughter back to rooms long silent, had filled the empty spaces with new memories. The branding ceremony still took place each spring, though it had evolved into something of a community celebration. Families from miles around gathered at the Thornwood Ranch to watch the next generation learn the trade of their parents, to witness the passing down of skills and traditions that defined life in Wyoming territory. Reed's trial and execution had marked the end of an era in Coldwater. The railroad had eventually come through, but on terms negotiated by the townspeople rather than imposed by corrupt officials. Victoria had run the town council until her death 5 years ago, ensuring that progress never came at the expense of those who'd worked the land for generations. Sullivan had retired as sheriff a decade ago but still lived in town, stopping by the ranch regularly to fish in the creek and tell the grandchildren embellished stories about the falcon. Hayes had trained a successor before his passing, a young doctor who maintained the same standard of care for everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. And Mason, Mason had found a peace he'd never thought possible. The nightmares that had plagued him after Margaret's death, that had returned briefly after the confrontation with Reed, had faded with time. The falcon remained a part of him, but no longer a ghost haunting his steps. "Grandpa," Margaret called, waving from the corral. "Come see, I'm going to do it." Mason rose from his rocking chair, moving with the deliberate care of advanced age. His side still ached where Reed's bullet had torn through him, a reminder that carried less pain with each passing year. In the corral, Sarah's husband Thomas had secured a calf to the branding post, a ritual unchanged since Mason's own father had taught him the skill. Thomas nodded respectfully as Mason approached, stepping back to give the old man room beside his granddaughter. "Ready?" Mason asked Margaret. The girl nodded, her expression solemn beneath her freckles. "I've been practicing all year." "Show me," Mason said. With Sarah watching proudly, Margaret pressed the heated iron to the calf's flank, her small hands steady. Her voice rang out clear in the summer air. "MT's star, this is my family's mark." The brand was perfect, clean lines forming the symbol that had bound together a family forged in fire and witnessed in daylight. "Well done," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion. Later, as the family gathered for dinner on the porch, Mason found himself watching them all, Sarah and Thomas, their children, even the ranch hands who'd become extended family over the years. The table overflowed with food and conversation, with the easy warmth of people who belonged together. Sarah caught his eye across the table, raising an eyebrow in silent question. "Are you all right?" Mason nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. He was more than all right. He was home in every sense of the word. That night, after the children were in bed, Sarah joined Mason on the porch. They sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said eventually. Mason considered his answer. "Just thinking about family," he said, "about what makes it real." "And what's your conclusion?" she asked, the ghost of a smile playing around her mouth. "It's not blood," Mason said slowly. "It's not even the law, though that has its place." He looked at her, the unwanted child who'd become the center of his world. "It's who you'd walk through a blizzard for, who you'd stand beside when every voice says stand down, who you'd burn your name next to." Sarah's eyes glistened in the moonlight. She reached across the space between their chairs, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I think that's enough," Mason said softly. "The land remembers, the brand holds. And when the lavender blooms each May, I know Margaret's watching. Know she's proud of what that unwanted child became." Together they sat in silence as the night deepened around them, two souls bound by choice and circumstance, by loss and love, by a family mark that went far deeper than any brand.